Um, hold on just a moment.
Too late.
Did you already go live?
Oh, I did. Nobody's gonna call me late this time. No, sir.
All right.
How's it going, chat? Good to see you all. Probably not active yet. It looks like it's still having some trouble getting started. Revving up that old engine. There we go. What's going on?
Oh, you entertain the fine people. I got to do something real quick. You talk to people, see how they're doing. I'll be right back.
Talk to people. Oh no, it's the one thing I'm worst at. How's it going, everybody? Good evening. Good morning, Clarice. Yes. We are here to discuss Snow White and the Seven Dwarves. Very interested in queens eating livers. Don't whether or not she had fava beans and a nice Chianti, up for debate. How's it going, everybody? I'm the old movie wasn't very accurate. Yeah, I agree. Snow White certainly should not have been white. Clearly, she was intended to be Hispanic, and the dwarves were intended to be a bunch of tall, strapping, muscular men in jean shorts and rollerblades from Venice Beach. So I'm very glad that they're going to be fixing those mistakes in the upcoming sequel or reboot, whatever you want to call it. Muggy, it's midnight where you are. Go to bed. Get out of here. Get out of here, son. What, do you not got work in the morning or something? Dwarves are famously tall. Exactly. That's what I've heard. Scandinavian types. Large lads. Snow White porn parody. Can't say I'm too familiar with that. Some minor differences from the fairy tale for the Snow White porn. My only minor ones. It was pretty. Those old fairy tales are pretty kinky. There's a line in the old fairy tale where because Snow White is sleeping in one of the dwarves' beds, then the dwarf whose bed she has taken has to be passed around his companions, for every hour for the night. So he's bouncing from grumpy to happy to dopey. Oh, just being handed around. It's an unfortunate life for that guy. Hannibal's a notorious fan of Snow White. That's why he's on screen. We want to make sure we're projecting the correct energy here. What is Grumpy's problem? He covets. Yeah, the Disney version really sanitized the pornographic elements of the original fairy tales, Had to make sure that there are subtle hints at them, but
Hello, I'm back.
hello. I was just discussing the very small changes between the original fairy tale and the porn parody of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Oh, of course, yeah. Mostly pretty faithful, I would say.
Yeah, for the most, like I was saying, there's that part in the fairy tale where the one dwarf gets passed around by all his companions during the night.
Well, Yeah, for
because
1 hour each.
in
Yeah.
1 hour each. Yeah, that's some stamina from each of them, you know? After working in the mines all day, to be able to put that kind of performance down, that's something that we just don't have anymore.
Anyway, some part of my AC unit in my crawl space was making a really loud rattling, humming sound, so I had to crawl down in there and try and get it to stop. So that's what I was up to. Anyway, how's everyone doing? I hope everyone's having a wonderful Sunday. Oh, I see we're still looking at Hannibal. Maybe we could change it to the right one now.
Well, you know, considering in the oldest version that I was able to find, the queen specifically requests the huntsman bring back Snow White's liver, which is true. I'm not
Oh,
making that
yeah.
up. It's a liver. It's her liver and lungs that she wants rather than her heart in the original 1812 edition. Um,
Interesting.
so you know,
Did she eat it with some
some
fava
fava
beans
beans
and
and a
nice
nice
Chianti?
Chianti.
Yeah.
Uh,
Chianti, sorry. Yes,
No,
of
no,
course.
she ate it with a little bit of salt, and she was very pleased with herself, apparently. Um, so
Interesting. Yeah,
yeah,
we'll talk all about that. Today we're going to be talking. You might have done an intro already, but I'm going to do one again anyway. Today we're talking about Disney's classic 1937 animated film Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. First of all, I always thought it was dwarves with a V, but apparently
yeah,
it's dwarfs with an S. Um, Incredible film, very iconic, very influential, very important in the history of especially animated feature films.
yes. Where it all began. This is the first Disney theatrical animated feature.
True.
It
It
is
is.
1937, and it looks remarkable. I mean,
Oh yeah.
like, honestly, it's beautiful. Some of the best animation you'll find, really. I
It holds
mean,
up. It holds
yeah,
up really well. Very charming. Some of the shots are incredibly pretty. For example, what I was most struck by is the final shot of the film. I had totally forgotten about the sort of
the
castle in the
golden
sky.
castle in the sky. Yeah.
Yeah, that was pretty. That was pretty cool. I like that. There's a lot of great stuff in this movie.
My favorite
Yeah.
scene probably is when she's running through the woods and all of
Well,
the.
yes.
God, it's beautiful.
I used that in the video we made, making fun of Wisecrack for saying the Disney ruined culture.
Yeah,
He talked about how these movies are all sunshine and rainbows. Now, while of course these films like Snow White, for example, and also Pinocchio are very kid friendly, there's some dark stuff in there for
yeah,
sure. Not quite as dark as the original fairy tales, but
yeah. Well,
they still
not
have it.
entirely. This is a pretty faithful adaptation, I would say.
All things considered, yeah. Yeah, it's got the general spirit right. And so, yeah, when she's running away from the huntsman, who again is sent there to kill her, that's still very much part of the story.
Yeah,
Um, and then she runs through the forest, and all the sort of logs and trees are turning like anthropomorphic, and it's a very fun little nightmare trip sequence. I was always a fan of when the logs turn
turn
into
into
crocodile
alligators. Yeah,
alligators. Yeah, it's cool stuff, man. Yeah, a lot of great animation in this movie. I'm excited to talk about the story, the original story, because of a number of different versions. You might have mentioned this already as well. You have describe the version of Grimm's brothers version of this story that you have, because there's a few different versions, and we're going to talk
yeah.
about all of them.
So I have two. I recently the one that I was working with prior to like a couple of days ago is based heavily on the original English translation by Margaret Hunt, and that happened in 1884. But the original tales were released in 1812 by the Brothers Grimm, and
To be clear, like recorded them almost more anthropologically, by
yes,
interviewing people and have them tell the tales, and they just sort of just transcribed them. Sometimes there's confusion. People think they authored them, but they're
yeah, no,
incredibly old folk tales that were written down by the Brothers Grimm, essentially.
yes, and they transcribed them and released them, and the book was very heavy with footnotes. The original version, yeah, so it didn't gain a lot of traction in its first edition. It wasn't until several revisions and re-released editions later that they finally kind of took off, and most of those were done by Wilhelm Grimm, not by Jacob Grimm. He kind of, went off on it, went a little rogue and kept the project going while his brother sort of, took took a step back from doing these translations and these new editions. Um, so I have access to the a new version recently released where somebody went back to the 1812 edition, kind of eliminated the footnotes and just translated the original version of the tales, in a maybe more accurate sense than probably, than would have been done before, before that 1812 version had achieved popularity. So I did a little compare and contrast between that 1812 version and my 1884 edition, and that was pretty interesting. There's a few minor changes. Most of it is still the same, but there are some rather large discrepancies that I'm excited to talk about today.
So, how should we? I suppose we should talk about the movie's story first. First, I want to acknowledge people talking in the chat that, yeah, this is a pretty big deal for Walt Disney, you could say. Obviously,
Yes,
the movie was huge. It won a number of awards at the Oscars and things like that. This was sort of, people pointed out that this was sort of a make or break film for him, that he put a lot of effort into it, a lot of money and time and effort into this. And, it was a make or break thing for Walt Disney. It was interesting to look at the credits and see that this is so old that like it wasn't even distributed by Disney. It was distributed by RKO Pictures, which is just
yeah,
crazy to think
that
of
is nuts,
nowadays.
isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of people are mentioning in the chat that you have to realize that they used pencil and papers, no modern technology to help this along. This is all
Hmm.
hand animated,
And
meticulously
it's
done,
great.
and it
And it's
looks
great,
beautiful.
especially Snow White herself, who almost looks rotoscoped. I'm sure there's a word for this style of animation, but it's you clearly they use what would you
A
say?
model.
Like a live model but the motion is really good.
Yeah,
It's really quite remarkable.
yeah, I really enjoyed too like all of her motions, the body language that she does,
Yeah.
it's all very 30s, right? Like it's this really fun, like almost stage presence that she's got for
Well,
for this.
it feels
Yeah,
like an old musical in a lot of ways too.
yeah,
And I want to talk about the music in more depth later, but I'm a big fan of the music in this movie.
yeah, me too.
It hits a lot of notes, no pun intended. It's part like Broadway show tunes, Tin Pan Alley sort of vibes, and then it has moments, especially when the dwarves are chasing the evil queen as the old peasant woman witch lady. They're chasing her, and the music is very like classical romantic, like I don't know, Holst, Beethoven, Mahler, that sort of stuff. It's quite varied, the musical styles, but it all coheres into one thing. Very impressive. Yeah, and the songs are really nice too. A lot of them, some of them are especially catchy, really stick with you,
Yeah,
iconic stuff. Um, yeah, so we'll talk more about specific animation and musical moments as we go, but let's jump into the story.
sure.
Oh, before we do that, Pie Guy, thank you very much for the super chat. Asks, "What's your favorite Grimm tale?" His is Hansel and Gretel. A fine choice. What would you say? You?
Hmm. I'm a fan of Rumpelstiltskin. I like that story.
Okay, that's a fun one.
Yeah,
I'm not as familiar. I know I've read that one before, but it's been a long time.
he
What's the
basically
what's the gist of that
the
one?
gist of that one is he is essentially um tricking people into, he spins straw into gold and gets like, basically like makes Faustian bargains with them,
Yeah,
um and if you can, he ends up taking the queen's child, um and he'll only give it back if you can speak his name, because he keeps his name a secret, and they find out that his name is Rumpelstiltskin, and then he ends up tearing himself in half when the queen gets it right by means of spies. It's a pretty interesting little story. I always just found it kind of neat. I like the sort of villainous and trickstery stories
yeah,
a lot. Those
yeah.
I just love them, man. I love trickster stories. I'm a fan of those.
Uh, Mike the bike says they did. No, what does he say? Oh, Hold on. Can't remember who. Oh, Nick the Greek, thank you. Says the movie is a favorite of Gremlins too. Yes, I quite love the scene where they're watching this movie in Gremlin. Good stuff. Um, my favorite Grimm's Brothers story is probably The Fisherman and His Wife. Are you
Which I
familiar with
am
that
not
one?
I'm not super familiar with that one.
A man is fishing along a lake or river or something to that effect, and he catches a magic fish that's like, "Oh, if you let me go, I'll grant you a wish." And he doesn't ask for anything. And then he goes home, and his wife's like, "What do you mean you didn't ask him for anything? Next time, ask him for this." And so he goes back, and he sees the fish again, and he asks him for what his wife got him. And then, I'm pretty sure it's like a slightly nicer hut, essentially, that they're living in. Um, he goes, then they have it, and it's beautiful, but she always wants more and more and more and more, so she keeps sending him back. And eventually, like, they have a castle, and eventually, like, she wants to be God herself. And then so he goes back to the fish, and the fish is like, and then he goes back and he's back to living in a hut. That's the very short version. It's about a nagging, greedy wife who wants more, 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 and then eventually she wants to be God, and God's like, nope, but you're back to the hut. And something it's funny. It's funnier than a lot of the other ones, and I always picture what's his name, Jim Nance from Twin Peaks. Is that his name?
Jim
Jack Nance?
Jack.
What's his name?
Gordon? Who are we? Who are we?
No, hold on. The actor. Hold on. I'm trying to remember. No, it's not Jim Nance. What's the guy's name? Sorry, I'm blanking here. There's a fish in the percolator. What's that guy's name?
Oh. I don't remember. What is that guy's name?
It's the same actor that's in Eraserhead, but I can't remember his name right now. Jack Nance. Yes, that's his name. Jack Nance. I always picture as the fisherman, and Catherine. I can't remember the actor's name from Twin Peaks. I always picture as the wife. And so, if you read it with that in mind, it's pretty funny. Anyway, the fisherman and his wife. It's funny stuff. I like it. Yeah. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Okay, sorry. Catherine is Piper Laurie, right? The Carrie's mom, the actress.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
it is.
Anyway, yeah, let's get into Snow.
Anyway.
Random side notes. Let's get into Snow White today.
Here's what you should do. Here's what you should do. As a side note, you should go read The Fisherman and His Wife and picture it as those two from Twin Peaks.
Okay.
And I think you'll enjoy it. So, this movie starts with like the classic sort of storybook opening intro shot in live action. I like the way that it opens without being touched, in air quotes. Obviously, they just hide where the string or hand opening it is, but it's nice. I like it. And we see this very elaborate, fancy book with the story, and then we dissolve into the story itself. The basic, I guess, arc of the story is obviously that, we have the evil queen who...
Her evil stepmother, who is jealous of her beauty. She wants to be the most beautiful in all the land, and this young girl is slowly getting more beautiful by the day, and the mirror is basically telling her, yeah, you're beautiful now, but one day she's gonna surpass you. And
I think she says, I think the mirror tells her that she has surpassed her. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so she has obviously green with envy about that, doesn't like it, tries to have her killed by the huntsman. The huntsman takes her out into the woods, and then right as he's about to kill her, he's like, God damn it, I can't kill this kid. She's like so perfect and innocent and all that. So I'll let her go. And she goes running off into the woods in that really fun sequence with all the spooky, trippy stuff. She eventually stumbles upon some animals who obviously can't talk, but she has this ability to commune with nature and all that sort of stuff. And they sing a happy song, and they lead her to the Seven Dwarfs house. She thinks it's a house for children. And so she goes to the house and she's looking at it and it's like, oh my God, this place is a mess.
It's a pigsty. Look at this. And so she cleans it up for them. They have this little song where they, go through, they dust everything, they wash all the dishes. There's a little sequence of the animal, like the squirrels, like brushing dust off with, yeah, everything like that. Just cute little animals doing cleaning chores and
That's
stuff.
quite a bit of that's quite a lot of the
It's
movie
quite a
is
lot of the
cute.
movie. Yes,
It's cute animals doing cute things. Yes,
yeah.
it's fun for the kiddos. And eventually, the dwarves return home and they find her sleeping in their beds, and they're like, "What?" And there's a very prolonged sequence where they're like, "What's that? Someone's in our house." Like, we'll have to sneak up on it, and like, there's all sorts of fun slapstick, especially with Dopey. And then eventually they get up there and they're like, "Oh no, it's a pretty girl." Well, we don't want to, obviously, we're not going to kill her. And they say, "You can stay here," because she offers to clean up after them and take care of them and make them food. And they're like,
Yeah.
"Food? Hell yeah, dog. This is great. This is a great
Well,
deal."
she already started the food as well.
Yeah,
It's
the
already
soup.
cooking. The soup is already cooking, and they're like, "Well, shit, man. Like, yeah, that's a pretty good deal." I don't know. The
Yeah,
only one who's not happy about it is Grumpy because he's
yes. Who is, I think, the best character in the movie. Grumpy's
yeah,
great.
I think Grumpy's pretty fucking fun.
Yeah, it's just such a fun dynamic that they're all like, "Oh my gosh, pretty lady cooking us food. This is great." And he's like, "Ah, women.
You can't be trusting him.
Can't trust them." Yeah, it's fun stuff. And then she slowly wins him over and all that. She helps them. Basically, they're kind of like, uh, they're in Arrested Development in some sense.
Yeah,
They're like
they're
children.
living like bachelors, and along comes
Yeah,
this
but they
woman
have to
who,
learn basic
yeah,
things about being a civilized person like kids do, like to wash up before dinner and all that sort of fun stuff. And she sort of brings that out of them. And then eventually the evil queen finds out that she's still alive and finds out that the huntsman tricked her by bringing her back a boar's or a pig's heart.
hmm
She's not happy about that. And so she's like, "I know what I'll do. I'll disguise myself as an old hag with a poisoned apple and I'll go kill her myself." And so she goes, and even though the dwarves tell her, "Don't let anyone in. There's, all sorts of strangers in these woods," and the old queen, she's tricky. I think they even say at
they
one
even say
point
she has black magic. Yeah,
she has black magic and she can turn herself invisible. She could be in this room with us right now. I
yeah,
think that's a funny moment. And so she comes by with the apple and she pretends to be a nice old lady as much as she can with her getup, and she tries to poison her with the apple. Interesting, this is one of the biggest differences between this version of the story and the other ones we'll talk about, is the witch says this is a magical wishing apple. If you take a
yeah.
bite of it, you can get anything your heart desires. So you make a wish. Wishing, obviously, a big theme in Walt Disney's work across a number of his movies. So this is, I guess, where that first shows up.
Yeah, well,
Perhaps.
you would say I mean, the very first time we see Snow White, she's working outside, and there's a wishing well, and that's her first song, right? Is like she's singing
Yes.
to the doves about how this is a magic wishing well, and that's when she meets the prince for the first time. So it's it's a big difference in that it also is like there's a particular character thing that the queen understands about Snow White that she uses to manipulate her into,
Yes.
yeah, which is a big change from the fairy tale that's not quite, not quite present at that time in those versions. The consistency of character isn't really something that the fairy tale people were concerned about.
Well, yeah, it's interesting, yeah, because we'll talk about the other versions and what the sort of apple represents and what it's there to do. But here, it's a temptation to get anything your heart desires. It's a magical wishing apple. You make a wish, and obviously, the queen knows that Snow White will wish for her true love from the prince to come and save her and all that sort of stuff. And so she takes a bite of the apple, and it kills her. And of course, the seven dwarves are very mad about this. They see the witch getting away. They chase after her, and they chase her through the rain and thunder up to a cliff. And then the witch tries to use a stick to push a boulder down to kill the dwarves, but she's struck by lightning essentially and killed. On She falls down into the ravine or whatever. And she's dead. She's killed. But now Snow White is dead as well, and the dwarves are clearly not happy about that. They're grieving. They're sad and everything. Is it? Okay. I was going to ask if it was said, but then I remembered that it's text on screen that tells us that she was too beautiful still, even in death, that they didn't want to bury her in the ground, so they
Yeah, they
get a
build the
glass
glass
coffin.
coffin. Yep.
Yes, and they put that in the woods in a nice little clearing, and that way she can be preserved. And they don't want to bury her in the ground because she's too beautiful even in death, and so they leave her there. Eventually, the prince hears about this, right? How does he hear about it? This is also text on screen,
I
but I
think
can't
it
remember
just says
exactly.
he hears about a beautiful maiden in a glass coffin in the mountains. Yeah, and so
Yes, and
he
so
comes there to see her,
he comes
and
to check it out, and it's her. And he approaches, and then he gives her a kiss. And it's interesting because in this version, he kisses her to wake her, which is not the case in all of them. But he doesn't see. I kind of forgotten exactly how it plays out. He kisses her kind of just in like a respectful, sort of loving thing. It's and then he doesn't expect it to do anything. That's the thing that I had forgotten. So he doesn't expect anything to happen, but he gives her a little kiss, and then he sort of kneels down, and then she wakes up, and the music soars, and it's
yep,
beautiful and triumphant, and then he carries her off. Essentially, everyone's singing and dancing and
and he
making
carries her off
merry.
to a golden castle in the sky. Hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, after, and it's interesting because I don't know if I can't remember if the text on screen says this in the movie, but yeah, in the fairy tales, it's 3 days of weeping before she's reawakened. Yeah, or before the prince comes
Yes.
by. So yeah, very interesting. Interesting symbology going on in this story. Is
Well,
one
there's
of
a lot
very
to talk about.
rich.
Yes, and there's a lot of parallels, at least from the Grimm's brothers version that most people are familiar with, based, like you said, on those later, uh, sorry, those earlier translations and footnotes and stuff like that. There seems to be some evidence that there was a conscious attempt to add little details to have it fit more with Christian symbolism. So now the question is, did the original have some of those elements?
Some, yes, some, but
Yes.
not nearly as many. Yeah, so I took some notes here with this. You know, there are still 3 days of weeping. The number
Hmm.
seven recurs quite a lot in the story. You know, seven dwarves, seven.
Yeah.
She's 7 years old in the story, so you know, there's holy
Oh, in the
numbers.
original, she's seven? I didn't know
Yeah,
that.
she's 7 years old in both the original and in the 1884 translation. This all happens when she's 7 years old.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I don't remember that in the version, the Grimm's Brothers copy I have. That's
Oh,
interesting.
yeah. I mean, if you check it out real quick, it might say something about that. It's usually it's right at the beginning that it says that she's 7 years old. Um, but in one of the things that that does not happen in the original one that does happen in the 1884 version and in the Disney version is that right after she's done, done in the house, doing all the cleaning and everything. In the Disney version, she kneels down by one of the beds to say a prayer before she goes to sleep. That is in the 1884 version. That is not present in the original one. So they did not, include that she's saying her prayers before bedtime.
In
Um,
the when she's in the dwarf's house?
yeah,
Okay, that's not in the movie, is it?
yeah, it is.
Oh, I forgot that.
Yeah, she says a little. She says a little prayer when she kneels down before she falls asleep.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's very classic Disney scene of somebody kneeling by a bed and there's like moonlight coming through the window. It's very pretty, very like serene imagery.
Yes.
Yeah,
Oh, here's a question. In terms of especially Christian religious symbolism, in the original, the very first version, do they say when they're talking about the apple, is the phrase shalt surely die in there?
yeah, in both of them.
Okay,
Yeah,
interesting. Right, because you may have noticed the apple being a big part of what's happening here. There are some parallels to Adam and Eve. Um, and that when I read that line, the like shalt surely die thing, I was like,
yeah.
oh, that seems like a pretty intentional reference there. And there's a few little references there that I find interesting. Okay, so the general gist is the same, but little things like her praying before bed are not included in the original. Is that right?
Yeah, and there's also a mention in the original English version that over the 3 days of weeping, an owl on the first day shows up to, mourn Snow White, then a raven on the second day, and then a dove on the third day when the prince arrives, which
Yes,
is, yeah,
that's in the version I have as well.
not
There's a
in
lot of
the original.
interesting.
Yeah.
Huh.
So yeah, very interesting little additions like that where it's very much very much paralleling some of the the biblical stories of Jesus's death and resurrection, right? And like there's always a little bit of that in the fact that she
Yeah.
dies and then comes back to life, but yeah, a little bit more that like an owl that sort of represents like age and wisdom in most general symbology of when you think of the owl, the raven that represents death, ill omen, and then a dove, which tends to represent
Hope and all
lightheartedness
that
and
sort of
hope.
stuff.
So yeah,
Yes, seven is how old she is when the queen first chases her out. It's never really specified how long she's with the dwarves. All they really imply in the version I have is that she's there for a while.
yeah,
She's doing that for a while. She's tending to their house and cooking for them and all that sort of stuff. Um, in the movie, she's the same age. We don't see her aging at all,
yeah.
but she appears to be older than seven.
I think very
Yeah.
clearly she plays the
Yes.
role of the mother to the dwarves, I would say.
Yes.
So, so almost got a little like you can see the groundwork that he's gonna lay for Mary Poppins later on.
Well, there's a little bit of Wendy from Peter Pan as well.
Yeah, a little bit of that too. There's some, and one of the other interesting things that I found about the Disney version is that there's a moment at the beginning where it describes how the queen initially is jealous of Snow White, and so she forces her to dress in rags and work as a scullery maid, which is very Cinderella, and does not happen in the fairy tale version from the book.
Yes.
So.
I don't know about that early.
Yeah, I don't know, Eric. It's
but yes, that's the gist of the story. There's obviously specifics that will be relevant that we'll get into, but that's the sort of the overarching thing. I wanted to get the overarching story out of the way so we can talk about some of the other versions and the broad similarities and differences. Then I also wanted to mention, because there's a few different versions we'll be talking about today, I have with me, hold on. This is a version from well, it kind of feels weird to call him a YouTuber, though he is a YouTuber. He is a writer and Greek Orthodox icon carver on YouTube named Jonathan Pajot. I've referenced his work a couple times, like in that video making fun of Patrick Willems for thinking that movie trailers aren't art. I mentioned Jonathan Pajot talking about the definition of art because I think he's got a lot of interesting things to say on the topic. He's an interesting guy. He talks a lot about symbolism, mostly in Christian stories, but he does talk about movies and things like that. That's how I first stumbled upon him, is talking about symbolism in movies. He wrote a version of Snow White that is like just beautifully illustrated. See if you can, while I describe it, see if you can find a picture on Google of just some of the illustrations because it's really pretty. His version is called The Tale of Snow White and the Widow Queen. So there's some broad similarities, as you would imagine, between this and the other versions of the story. But one of the things that this version makes clear specifically, and that the Grimm's brothers versions makes clear, though the Disney movie kind of glosses over it, is that her mother died in childbirth, and this is the woman that her father remarried.
Yeah.
Right. This is the new queen, so this is her stepmother, and that's classic Grimm's brothers fairy tales. Based like half of the Grimm's brothers fairy tales, Hansel and Gretel, and many of the others are about evil stepmoms and stepfathers.
Yeah, well, and so very
Quite a bit of
interestingly,
them.
my version, the 1884 version, mentions that the original 1812 edition, it's just her mother.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in the original version, it is Snow White's mother, the same woman who wishes for a beautiful daughter, white as snow, red as blood, and black as the wood of the ebony, right? And then as the daughter ages, the mother starts to grow more and more jealous because she's the beautiful one, and she sort of regrets, the wish that she made. In the 18,
That's
yeah,
very different. That's
very.
very
That's one
different.
of the big differences that I wanted to mention, is that yeah, the original version, it is her mother, her birth mother, not the yeah, not the stepmom.
Interesting. So I want to talk about because this is Snow White and the Widow Queen by Jonathan Pajot. It's a nice little book, beautiful illustrations, like I said. I wanted to look at specifically what he focuses on with the whole Widow Queen aspect because I find it interesting. So like it starts very much the same. Um, her Snow White's mother makes a wish for to have a child. It's specified in his version that she was barren and thought to not be capable of conceiving a child, and she makes a wish to have one, and then does have one, and then dies in childbirth. Right?
Yeah.
That's and then in his version, the king remarries a foreign queen. Um, who comes in and he becomes so obsessed with like lavishing her with gifts and everything and all that sort of stuff that he kind of uh he what would you say? He doesn't take care of his actual like kingly duties and everything like that. And people start to get distrustful of this woman. And then eventually he's killed, the king,
Mm,
by a hunter. He's killed by
interesting.
like a bow and arrow kind of mysteriously, and it's not made explicit, but it's very heavily implied that that the queen had him killed to basically usurp and replace him, which is interesting.
That is
Uh,
really interesting. I've got a so I've got the cover on screen right now, which
yeah,
is a beautiful. Like I was stunned when I saw that on the Kickstarter originally. Like that just
yeah,
looks fantastic. Got very similar vibes to the like those Barnes and Noble leather-bound classic editions that just look really really nice on your shelf. So
yeah,
I like that. And then I've got a few of the page illustrations coming through, as we're talking. I'll pull
yeah. It's
those
pretty
up.
cool. I'm a fan of it. But so what I was saying is he makes it more explicit that the stepmother has no like why she grows up. She's basically raised by the servants. I think he says that specifically. That he's always like that she's like raised by the servants and they give her what she can, so she's dressed in rags for that reason. And that like she's always asking the servants to tell her stories about her mother and all that sort of stuff. And then the probably the most I think the most interesting symbolic difference, just it's a small detail, but in this version, the queen has a handheld mirror instead of a mirror on the wall, and the line
Mm.
is "Mirror, mirror in my hand, who's the fairest in the land?"
Oh,
And
that is
uh,
interesting.
you can yeah, you can see it there in green on the right side of the screen. She's got the little handheld mirror with light shining onto her face. Looks a little bit like a phone, doesn't it?
Yeah, just a little. That
Just a
is
little bit.
really interesting. To sort of and that's something that I like about what he is very fluent in that sort of symbology, Jonathan Pageau. So
Yeah.
I have every confidence that this was a deliberate choice to sort of make the
Oh yeah.
symbology relevant to.
Yeah, he's talked about it a little bit, and yeah, he said he discovered it in another version of the story, one of the many versions that have been written. That there was a handheld mirror, and then he saw that and was like, "Ah, that's interesting. I'm using that."
There is something a little bit more. I do like that a lot, right? Because there is something a little bit more. It makes it seem like she is actively pursuing and like carrying around a hand mirror and asking it questions, like who's the most beautiful, is like very much more actively pursuing that kind of affirmation, as
Yeah.
opposed to it being on the wall. That's just really an interesting little change. I think it works. I got another long page here. This is just beautiful, of Snow White running from the huntsman.
Oh yeah, yeah. Oh, and so his version, like the Grimm's brothers fairy tales, but not like the Disney movie. There are three attempts, classic fairy tale stuff, three attempts by the evil queen to kill Snow White, and
Yes.
they're slightly different in Jonathan's version than the Grimm's brothers. The Grimm's brothers, the first one is a corset, right?
Yeah,
It's she
it's
goes
like lace, it's a lace.
lace to make a corset or something along those lines. And she goes and she says like, "Oh, she's selling her wares and like, oh, look at this beautiful lace. Would you like some?" And she's like, "Oh," she's very tempted by it. And then she ties it around her too tight and she loses her breath and she passes out dead. Or
Yeah.
presumably dead. And then the witch leaves. The dwarves return to find her unconscious and they wake her up and then they warn her and then the witch tries again the next day.
The
What's
second
the
one is a
next
poisoned comb.
poison comb? Yes,
Yeah.
that is identical to Jonathan Pajot's version.
Yeah.
He uses the poison comb as well. The
So
first one he does is like a
these three are all consistent pretty much from like
yeah.
across all the versions that I've read. It's the lace and then the poison comb is next, and then like the poison seeps through her hair, and the dwarves
Yeah.
have to come back and wash her hair with water and wine, and
Hmm.
that's how they revive her the second time.
And then the last time is the poisoned apple. In his version it's a golden apple.
Oh, that's interesting. That's not okay. So in the original version, the 1812, the apple is entirely red. It's just a very a bright, tempting red
Beautiful,
apple.
perfect. Yeah,
In
exactly.
the 1884 version, there are two halves of the apple. There's a white half and a red half. And I think it says, let me double check here, but I'm pretty sure it says that only the white half is poisoned because the apple is made, so craftily. Is the Oh no, the red cheek. The red half is the poisoned one. Only the red cheek is poisoned.
Interesting.
Yeah. So
In his version, only the skin is poisoned.
oh
No, that's the one. And now I'm getting them all confused. But at least one of them, only the skin is poisoned, and the witch tricks her by saying, "Oh, look, she cuts it up, and then she eats the core herself," which is, I guess, a thing people did back then. I guess if you were
yeah,
really hungry, you just eat the apple core, right? She eats the core, and then Snow White is like, "Oh, well, then it must be safe to eat." But the poison's only in the
that's
skin.
really interesting, isn't it? Like that the poison is like the queen eats the center of it, like get
Hmm.
there, and she eats the surface of it, and that's what is where the poison is. That's interesting. Interesting in terms of like the whole story being about beauty,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the thing that I feel like is obviously it's there in the Disney version, but I think the choice to have it just be the apple and not the other things is a not the smartest decision, only because you lose a little bit of sort of what's at the core of it. And I think it's pretty clear that among many other things, the story is about beauty, right? Because when she's coming to tempt her and try and kill her, it's all things that like supplement her beauty, right?
Yeah.
It's lace and beautiful clothes. It's a nice comb, not a comb you would. It's like old-fashioned comb that you would just keep in your hair as an accessory, not like a tool to unknot it. Yeah, they're all accessories to her beauty, and then obviously the sort of Adam and Eve parallel comes in because the apple is kind of, among other things, like has the knowledge of beauty in it. Sort of like in Adam and Eve, it's like the knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah.
It's like self-awareness is the last thing that she like tries to give her. And it's all and there's an idea there. I think Jonathan Pajot has talked about it in detail in one of his videos. You can probably find it. But there's a sort of idea that the witch is trying to tempt her by becoming self-aware of her own beauty, right? Because she's
Mm.
this young, innocent, pure little girl who's just naturally beautiful and everyone likes her and she's very nice and pleasant and all that sort of stuff. But she's not like aware of her beauty in a sense, you know what I mean? And so like she's trying to make her aware of it. I think it's even said in his version, Jonathan Pajot's version, that the witch is like says something about how beauty is a weapon, and then
Oh, interesting.
so there's like little things like that trying to make her essentially less beautiful by having her become aware of it in a sense,
That is, yeah, that is real.
becoming self-aware of it.
That's a really fascinating choice. I like that. I like that a lot, actually.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The other, I think, the last major departure in his version that I found quite interesting was that they're not the dwarves aren't miners when she goes to meet them. They're thieves in the woods.
Oh, really? That's
Yeah,
interesting. Okay,
they're still
because
dwarves. They're still dwarves. They still they're not named Sleepy and Dopey. There's like a short one, a fat one, a skinny one, a cross-eyed one. You know, they all have sort of weird quirks like that, but they're all thieves living in the woods. And then part of the arc of the story in his version is that she goes out to the woods and she meets up with them, and she kind of like brings, it calls them to be better, essentially. At one point, because like the witch comes to try and tempt her, and she's like, "No, you can't let people in. There's dangerous people in the woods. There's thieves and all sorts of stuff like that." And then like she's like, "But you wouldn't hurt me, would you?" And then they're kind of like a little ashamed of being thieves, and so they go back to being miners, which is what they did before.
oh,
And then
interesting.
and so then he even throws in a cheeky line where it's like, and then, like they're going back to work in the mines and everything, and he says like, and for the first time in a long time they whistled on their way to work, which is very clearly a cheeky little reference. But that's another difference, is that they're sort of thieves and criminals and outlaws, and then she kind of, you know,
Yeah, she brings him back to, the life of an
yes,
honest
exactly,
working man kind of thing. That's
yeah,
interesting. I like that. That's a fun divergence, fun
yeah. There's a
refresher.
few like that, and I think. But it does have that same three different attempts to kill her, three different temptations, all having to do with beauty. And I think it was maybe a mistake to get rid of those
Oh, in the
in the
Disney
Disney
version?
version. It still works, right?
Yeah.
And it still has to do with desire, right? The apple, like what she wants more than anything. But I think part of the reason that maybe it isn't quite as strong is that like what she desires is so like wholesome and pure. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's
well,
not
so what I did notice about the Disney version is that the one of the ways that she tries to convince her to take the apples in the first place is by saying like, well, men like apple pies best. Like those are really like
right,
this is like so she's
right.
playing off of her altruistic nature. She knows she can't really like tempt her into taking an apple for herself. And then
Yeah,
until she decides to say like, oh, but it's a wishing apple, which is playing off of the wishing well desire, right? But the original thing she goes for is like, well, they say, don't you think they'd like these better than what you're doing now? Like, wouldn't that be nicer for them if
yeah,
you did this? Which I did like that. It's a little subtler in the Disney version how many temptations there are, but I think she tries like three different tacts in that one scene. She
I think you're
tried,
right. Yeah,
yeah, which is like I do like that. I think that it's a pretty efficient way of getting it done in this sort of story, right? The way that
yeah,
Disney wanted to do it. I think it's an efficient way of getting it done.
yeah. I
Um,
think I think it's a largely very faithful adaptation, and
yeah,
there's a lot of good stuff. One thing that is interesting about the Disney version and Jonathan Peugeot's version, but not the original, is that in the Grimm's Brothers version, the prince just kind of shows up at the end out of nowhere. You
yeah,
know, in the Disney version, she has an encounter with him in the beginning when she's just a princess, but like a maltreated princess living in rags in the castle, being forced to do all the dirty work and all that stuff, like she's a servant. And then a prince comes along, hears her singing beautifully, and starts singing along with her. They have their little meet cute, you could call it. And then
yeah.
and then eventually he comes to save her at the end. In Jonathan Pajot's version, it's the same sort of thing. They have like a Romeo and Juliet style meet cute near the balcony of the castle wall and that sort of thing.
Oh,
Um,
interesting. Yeah,
but originally he's there to see the queen. And then he sees Snow White instead, and is like, "Who is that?" And the queen gets all jealous.
yeah. I like that. That's good.
Yep.
That's a good choice.
Yeah, there's
Um,
some good
yeah.
stuff in there. But
Real quick, I
enough
want
of
to
that. Go
for
ahead.
Wing Flanagan, who asks, "What about Rose Red?" Because he recalls Rose Red being part of the story at some point. I in my version, I did do a little because I read the Little Snow White story in preparation for this, and then noticed as I was looking through the rest of them, just because Grimm's fairy tales always fun to revisit. There is a story called Snow White and Rose Red, so I went and read that as well. That one clearly has very little to do with this Disney one. Revisiting it, it's Snow White and Rose Red are sisters. They were named after their mother's rose bushes. They live, all three of them, the three women, alone in a cottage in the woods. And then one day a bear comes by, and the bear,
Oh
like,
no.
at first they're really afraid, but the bear, it turns out, can talk. And he's like, no, 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 I just want to sleep by the fire because you got a nice warm house. And so they eventually let him in, and they're all friendly with the bear. And then Snow White and Rose Red are they go out in the woods. The beasts and the little animals and everything are their friends and buddies and pals, and they encounter a single dwarf who is a thief and kind of a. It's kind of funny how he. How coded towards certain Jewish stereotypes this dwarf it ends up being throughout the story. A
Yeah.
German fairy tale. Yeah, he's very like you have the stereotype of like the Jewish like nagging Jewish mothers and everything like that who can like nothing's ever good enough for them. You never like, and he's hoarding gold, and he's got.
Oh,
They
of
mention big noses, of course. So yeah, like all that kind of stuff. But the girls end up having a couple of encounters with him where they have to keep like cutting his beard to get him out of these situations that he's in, and he's always like, "How dare you cut my beard, you little bitches!" And he runs away with more gold and hides it, and then eventually, the bear comes along and eats the little dwarf. And it turns out that the bear all along had been cursed by the dwarf for taking some of his gold, and he was a prince, and so he takes them back to their castle, and he marries one of them. In this version, he marries one of them, and then he also has a brother who marries the other, and then they all move into the castle and live
All
happily
12
ever
and
after.
well.
Yeah, so I'm interested eventually on
funny
revisiting.
It's funny because some of these Grimm's fairy tales are very famous, and we're all pretty familiar with them, at least in the broad strokes. But there's some deep cuts, and you're like, oh, I get why this one wasn't famous.
Yeah.
Like this one, you know.
Yeah, well, and German fairy tales, short little men with long beards and big noses who hoard gold. I'm like, okay, I see how. Yeah, it was interesting to trace how we got from 1884 to 1945. Get.
Yeah, not the case with the dwarves in this. It's interesting to me that the dwarves are kind of like. They're all kind of like well, there's an interesting parallel with what's it called? Is Goldilocks, right? Where she comes into the house in the original story, and then they all have different beds. Like, oh, this one's too hard, this one's too soft, this one's too wide. All that sort of
I
stuff.
was gonna say there's a lot of Goldilocks in there in this one. So a big difference between the original fairy tales and the Disney version is that in order to basically in order to sort of like show Snow White showing her altruism, right, her character. In the Disney version, she comes in, the place is a mess, and she decides to clean it up for them. Put some food on the stove, and she just when she can't keep going,
a feminine, maternal sort of figure for them to help them, with all that sort of stuff.
Well, and being like, you could read it too as being like a generous guest, right? Like somebody who's very concerned with making sure that they aren't a bother and all that kind of stuff. And she does the same thing in the original fairy tales, but it's a little bit different. The house is already nice and neat, and there's food laid out. There's 7 plates and 7 cups of wine laid out. And so what she does is she, like, in order to not take too much from any one dwarf, she eats a little bit off of each plate and drinks a little bit out of each cup. And then she tries each of the beds, and some of them are too small, and some of them are too large, and then the 7th one is just right, which is a really just an interesting change for the Disney version. To
it's a very common thing in a lot of these fairy tales because you just mentioned that she in terms of not being too greedy, she like takes a little bit from all of them, but not from any one. And then there's something similar going on with. So in the Grimm's Brothers version, obviously there's still 7 dwarves, but she sleeps in the one bed that's just right, and then that youngest dwarf sleeps an hour with each of the other brothers, not with any one for the whole. So he's like, he
Yeah.
kind of, I don't know. There's a similarity there. But yes, in this version, they like in the original, they're not mentioned as one being like having quirky characters and names and stuff like that, like Grumpy and Sleepy and Dopey and all that sort of stuff. Um, that's not really mentioned, so
No.
that's a change for this, and I like that. I think it's fun that they're all well, they all have weird little quirks to them. Like Doc is like stammering and muttering all the time, and there's a lot of fun comedic moments where he just says the wrong thing and gets his words mixed up.
Yeah. I like that a lot. Oh, and
I quite
somebody
Go
in the
ahead.
chat actually asked, why is he called Doc when all the rest of them are called, grumpy, bashful, sleepy, sneezy, all that.
Hmm.
And apparently, one of the earliest story documents, this is from a Reddit post, so we can take it, but it from a Disney website, quoted. One of the earliest story documents in mid 1934 had suggested a dwarf called Doc, who actually was a doctor. The idea persisted for several months. Doc examined Snow White when she was poisoned by the witch, and in one outline, his stethoscope tangles up with his beard as the dwarves try to revive her. At this point, nothing was said about his being the leader, although he was described as the wise man of the family, a fatherly, practical, and understanding type. But by mid October 1934, some change had taken place. The character called Doc had assumed leadership, as well as the basic stammering personality he would retain in the film. He's the leader and spokesman of the dwarves' pompous, wordy dignity, feels his superiority, but is more or less a bit of a windbag, is the apparently the Disney note quotation from it. So he was originally supposed to be a doctor, but they moved on from that.
Yeah, they did not keep that. He's definitely not a pompous windbag in this.
No, he's just a little bit of a he's got the leadership.
Yeah,
He
they all look to
I
him
love
for
how he
some
always
reason.
he's like there's this charming older sort of line that he repeats a lot where he'll just be like, "Come on, men," like he's
Yeah,
leading people into a battle when they're going
yeah,
upstairs, and then
yeah.
pushing Dopey ahead. I really like the language that they use in this.
I like when they're going up to figure out what sort of horrible monster is upstairs, and they like send Dopey first. Like we're right behind you. It's great. Dopey, I like a lot of the fun quirks with the characters. I think if I had one complaint about the movie overall, is that some of these sequences with the dwarves kind of drag a little long for me. Like when they're all getting washed up, like that takes a long time.
Yeah,
That's all. I mean, the song's nice, it's fun, but some of the like when they're also thinking that she's a monster upstairs, it takes them a long time to finally get up there. And like that's
yeah,
probably where the only place where my enjoyment of the movie kind of falters at all, just because it drags a little for me. And then it feels like I know we're having fun, we're doing fun stuff for the kiddos, but it also feels like we're delaying the main story a little bit.
yeah. I'm with you on that. I think that there are certain points, especially God, the back half of that washing up scene where Dopey ends up swallowing the soap. And I'm just like, Jesus, God, come on. Like, we're just going to keep going. Yeah, I was zoning
Yeah.
out big time. It's I'm getting up and walking around, tidying up my living room a little bit. Like, I think I got some time, This is going to
Yeah.
go on for a while.
It does. That stuff goes on a little long, but otherwise, I'm quite a big fan of this movie. I like a lot of the musical numbers. Some of them I had forgotten about entirely, but every time I'm like, that was nice. Like
Yeah.
like the orchestration is really nice. Some of the songs she sings, I like "Whistle While You Work" a lot. I like the silly song that they sing while they're all dancing about.
Playing their instruments and everything. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
it's good
fun,
stuff.
man.
I like that Grumpy plays the organ and he just does it grumpily the whole time, but he's like really good at it. I don't know. All that stuff is fun when they stack on top of each other in the giant coat and they're dancing with her.
Yeah,
All
that's
very
cute.
charming,
That's very
very
cute.
silly. The
I
music is
do
very
love
good.
and one of the things I'm real excited about revisiting when getting further into this Disney project, right, is I do love a good Disney jam band scene. There are a
Yes.
lot of those in a lot
All the best ones have one.
yeah.
Like
That scene in
obviously,
Aristocats where they're like, where Scatman
oh
Crothers
yeah.
is jamming. I fucking love that scene, man.
I've always
I
been a big
can't
fan
wait.
of Trash in the Camp from
Mm-hmm.
Tarzan.
Mm-hmm.
When I was a little kid, I would like rewind the VHS and watch that over and over and over until my mom was like, "All right, that's enough of that. Please keep watching the rest of the movie." I would do that a lot. Yeah, and so this one, the silly song is kind of that for this movie. Good stuff. So I want to respond to some things in chat because I haven't been doing that enough recently. Um, do 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 do. Maybe the original had a more natural build up for the prince's arrival, or maybe not because it's just a kid's tale. Yeah, a lot of times when you read Grimm's brothers fairy tales, so what they are is like, folk tales told by, families and stuff like that for a long time. So people put their own weird spins and quirks into
Yeah.
them, and a lot of them I don't find especially satisfying as complete tales because they take really bizarre left-hand turns late in the story, or there's like a Deus Ex Machina sort of thing, or like I don't know, there's kind of uneven and strange some of these stories in terms of like pacing and how much time is given to certain parts of the story. Because these are all very casually told and remembered by people, not
Yeah.
necessarily written, not like the Hans Christian Andersen stories, which were all written by
Yeah.
one guy,
Or the
right?
Pinocchio novel that that he used for the next movie in the series.
Yes.
Like
And so, some of the best Grimm's Brothers fairy tales are the best and most famous because they kind of have that more coherent through line all the way through. But even still, Snow White in the original Grimm's Brothers fairy tale is just the prince is never mentioned until he hears about this beautiful woman in the forest, and he's like, "I'm gonna come check that
I
out."
gotta go. I'm on a
So
road
it
trip.
is,
I'm gonna go see what this. He's passing, a billboard
yeah.
that says "hot chicken coffin." He's just like, oh shit. Hey, why not? I got time.
A hot 7-year-old, hot dead 7 year
Hot
old.
dead 7-year-old and hottest dead 7-year-old in Germany.
Uh, no, but it feels weird to almost call it a Deus Ex Machina, but like it's kind of what it is because it just comes out of nowhere a little bit. But you got to remember that a lot of these stories are much more concerned with sort of um, broad thematic stuff in terms of
Yeah.
messages and morals, but also like the sort of deeper symbolism that isn't necessarily conscious, but like is part of why it makes intuitive sense to people, right?
Yeah.
They're less concerned with about the nitty gritty of plot construction.
And a lot
As
of these were probably told by people who, like these are the stories that they told their kids before going to bed, right? So, like Snow White
yeah,
is probably a story that German peasants that the Grimms talked to, told their daughters before they went to bed, like
hmm
as a way
yeah,
of calming them down, preparing them for it. And so it's just like, oh yeah, and so then a prince comes along, right? And so they all know that the prince is going to come along because they've heard the story a million times,
yes.
right? So it
And
doesn't.
and princes come along in a lot of these types of stories as well, so it
Yeah.
doesn't feel like surprising at all. But yeah, that's one of the things I actually do think is a slight improvement in the Disney version is that she meets the prince earlier. They have a sort of romantic connection, and then fate tears them apart, and then they come back together at the end. I think that's a much, stronger story, and so that's definitely an improvement, I would say.
Yeah. So J. Jameson is saying it's a little more kid friendly for the queen to fall off a cliff instead of murdered by dwarves. So actually, funnily enough, in the original version and in the 1884 version, what happens is the prince.
It's even crazier.
It's even crazier. Yeah, the prince wakes Snow White up. They get married. They invite the queen to the wedding. Who she finds out that that Snow White. Well, in the original one, so this is another interesting change that I found from the original to my version. She in the original one, the Snow White rhyme that the magic mirror tells her repeats at the end, so she is aware that Snow White has survived the poisoning attempt.
Yeah.
The way that she survived the poisoning attempt in the original one is that the prince basically says he can't live without seeing the beautiful girl in the coffin. Please, magic dwarves, can I have it? Right? Can I take it home? And
Yeah.
they take pity on him. They let him take it home. In the original version, he brings it to his castle, and he eats he eats in the same room as the girl. He can't go more than 5 minutes basically without looking at this beautiful dead girl who hasn't rotted yet, right? And so he starts having his servants
Well, when you
carry the
say it like
coffin.
that, Hugh, go ahead.
Well, they make a specific mention that she doesn't rot, like in
I
the
know.
original
Yeah,
one,
no,
right? Which
that's in
is,
all of the versions
yeah.
essentially.
Um,
That she remains beautiful even after death because she's beauty itself, right?
yeah, and so in the original one, what happens is he keeps having his servants pick the coffin up and carry it with him to whatever room he's going to be in the castle next.
Yeah.
Until the servants are just like, "What? Why are we doing this?" And one of them pulls her out of the coffin and like punches her in the back because he's so frustrated, and that dislodges the apple from her throat.
Wait, really?
That's the original 1812 version.
That's
Yeah,
so funny because in the later one that most people will find if they get a copy of Grimm's Brothers, like they're carrying it home and then they kind of stumble and that
that
dislodges the
dislodges the
piece of
apple. Yeah.
apple. But the fact that an annoyed servant accidentally does the Heimlich, that's pretty funny.
Yeah, that is really fun. It's a funny twist. But then so they in both versions they get married. In the original one, the queen realizes it's Snow White, but her vanity compels her to still show up at the wedding. In
Yes.
the newer one, or the 1884 one, the mirror says, "But the young queen is the fairest of all," and so out of curiosity, the
Yeah.
stepmother goes to the wedding. But either way, when she gets there, the prince, has heard the story of what has happened, and so he basically he has some iron shoes heated up and put on the queen's feet, and she's forced to dance in front of him and Snow White until she dies.
Yeah. Yep. That's how in both Grimm's Brothers versions, she has to put on iron like,
Molten
oven
iron
hot
shoes, yeah.
molten iron shoes and dance to death in front of everybody. So, I guess being struck by lightning and thrown off a cliff off screen is a slightly more palatable version because a lot has been made of the sort of softening of some of these fairy tales for Disney movies. I think some of it's a bit overblown. This is obviously a pretty
A
harsh
pretty, yeah,
difference,
harsh difference.
but here's the thing, and here's why I don't think it's actually, because here's the thing, showing that in an animated movie is quite a bit different than being told that.
Yeah,
Obviously your imagination is as strong as it is. It kind of depends on the person, depends on the kid, how much they can picture what dancing to death in iron shoes looks like. But seeing it is quite a bit different, I think. And so
yeah.
I think that would be worse than just hearing those
Well,
words.
and what does that
So
do to the character of Snow White, right? That like she is willing
yes.
to enact, like to allow her husband to enact that sort of scheme of vengeance against her, this person, right? Like that makes her a little
Yeah.
different of a character.
Yeah, a lot of these, especially these old folk tales, they have very harsh punishments for bad people. Um, you
Coming
know,
down from a medieval, especially like with the Grimm ones, coming down from a medieval and rather militaristic, society. I mean, German society, Prussian society in the 1800s is a pretty like rigid and like almost you could call it draconian. Like they really like the militarism of the Germans was famous at the time. I think H.G. Wells at one point called them the best and wickedest people on the earth when they were rising. When Germany kind of became, pre World War II, when Germany, or World War One, when Germany kind of unified for the first time and sort of became
yeah.
a player on the world stage. So that sort of like medieval torment and
Well,
like
one of the things that it's interesting. I was watching this really great video. Is basically a history lesson in disguise. Quite cleverly, it's a video. It's called like everything you need to know about time traveling to medieval Europe. And so, like, okay, so you're a time traveler going back to medieval Europe. Here's all the things you should know about where to go and what it'll be like, and what it'll be like if you're, not European descent, and all those sort of interesting questions. And it was basically a medieval European history lesson in a fun little package. But one of the things he talked about is crimes and like punishment and stuff like that. And a big reason why punishments were so severe is that like they hardly ever caught anybody.
yeah
And so, like, it was so rare to actually catch and punish criminals that, like, when you did, it was really important to, like, set a deterrence like that.
Yeah.
And so I thought it was an interesting thing. But yes, in a lot of the Grimm's Brothers tales, like you were bad, you were evil, you tried to kill someone. Well, now you have to dance to death in
While your feet burn. Yeah,
yeah,
like yeah.
it's pretty harsh. Interesting thing about Jonathan Pajot's version is that the evil queen, survives, and she, like, when Snow White is reunited with the prince who wakes her from her slumber and all that sort of stuff, he's like, "You've been in exile for too long. You need to go back to your rightful kingdom." And she's like, "Oh, what about the old queen?" And the dwarves are like, "We'll come with you." So they take up their arms and everything that they were using to steal from people and all that stuff for the sort of righteous cause
Hmm.
of returning her to her rightful kingdom and all that
Interesting.
sort of stuff, which
Yeah.
is a nice detail because they stop being criminals, but they, still have the capacity to fight and all that sort of stuff. So, when they go back, the queen is mysteriously gone. She vanished, and she's been gone for like several weeks or like a month or something. Eventually, um they get married, they have kids and everything, and one day she hears the guards talking about this crazy old hag that came up to the castle walls claiming that I used to be queen and all that stuff. And so they had her detained in the dungeon. And so Snow White goes down to the dungeon, sees through all the, like, the horrible wear and tear of living in the woods or wherever she's been, that this is the old queen, and decides to be compassionate and let her go. And then the end of the story is she's actually living in the cottage where the dwarves used to live at the end of the story.
Oh, interesting.
Because the
Hmm.
dwarves now they work as like guards and craftsmen and all that stuff for the kingdom. So they don't live in the woods anymore. And so she shows compassion to the evil queen, and now she lives in exile in the old house that the dwarves used to live in, which I thought was an interesting little detail. And if we're thinking about what the punishment for the queen says about Snow White as a character, I think that's probably my favorite version because
Y-
I like that she sort of retains um, a lot of
yeah.
the values she had at the beginning of the story, kind
So
of
the
thing.
thing that I really like about the Disney version, falling off a cliff after, like a sudden lightning storm, being chased by the dwarves, right? Snow White throughout the movie is shown as being sort of like, as she's in harmony with the natural world. The
Yes.
animal, like, there's that brief moment where she is scared, and everything, like the forest appears very harmful and spooky to her. Yeah, that great animated, like, horror dream sequence. But as she collapses and sort of like reaches this like bottom, the rock bottom moment at the end of it, everything sort of fades very nicely. Kind of like pulls out to a wider shot, fades out of the darkness, and it's more of a calm clearing in the woods, and she
Yeah.
sort of stops and gets some perspective. All the creepy eyes that have been watching her are actually just a bunch of adorable little deer and bunnies and squirrels and shit. And
Hmm.
so I like that the queen, when she kills Snow White, the natural world reacts in such a way that it ends up causing her demise, right? Like
Yeah.
that feels very
That feels
Shakespearean.
right.
That feels very
Yeah.
right to me. It's like in Macbeth, when you read Macbeth, he kills the king, and then they talk about how there was this tremendous storm that the natural world
Revolted, essentially.
revolted at
Yeah.
at disgust for this like incredibly unnatural thing that was just this horrible thing that
Yeah.
just happened. So I do like the way that Disney does
I
chooses
do.
to
I
do
like
it.
it too.
I like that a lot.
And the other thing is, like, because either way, whether she has to dance to death in the hot shoes or whether she's struck by lightning and dies, you get the sense of, like, well, evil doesn't pay, sort of thing, right?
Yeah,
Which is clearly what they're going for. But the implication that the king had that done to her
yeah. That's
feels,
it's
you
yeah,
know, it seemed, well, because it's cruel, not like they didn't just kill her or just imprison her. You know what I mean?
yeah. It's a full
And I
on
think there's
torture.
there's there's definitely something different about, like fate punishes people who do evil in like a folk story versus like at the end, we'll make sure that they're tortured to death.
Yeah, and I like the Jonathan Pageau version as well. The redemption, and the showing, like, I mean, that fits Snow White's character as it's built, right? Like,
Yes.
she is an innocent person who, like, she will sort of turn the other cheek, yeah, when
Yeah,
wronged,
she's a
right?
fundamentally good-natured
Yeah,
person. And so like that she shows compassion on her and lets her leave. Doesn't like allow her to stay, doesn't like give her a position in the cabinet, so to speak, but like it's like, all right, you can be free to go wander through the woods and everything.
yeah, and it's interesting because there's a book that I've read a few times now that I would very much recommend, just if anybody, for anybody who's interested in the storytelling aspects uh, of humanity. It's by Jonathan Gottschall. It's called "The Storytelling Animal: How Stories Make Us Human." Um, there's a lot of chapters about a lot of different types of storytelling in there, and like where it shows up in human beings throughout the years. But one of the really interesting chapters for me is that he, is a sociologist who did a lot of observation of children, telling stories, right? Like, and the stories that they tell when asked to tell a story, and
Yeah.
that kind of thing. And the dancing to death with iron shoes is a very common kind of thing that a child might enjoy or have come up with. They
Hmm.
One of the things that he points out is that even like little boy stories and little girl stories are all relatively different in general. Like when they kind of play
Yeah.
pretend and act them out, right? um
Hmm.
but in almost all of them there is like death and fear, and like like a lot of the little girl stories that he observed, they'd be like, oh, there's a tiger trying to eat my baby, so I have to do this or else the baby will be eaten,
Hmm.
and then like all these kinds of things, and the things that they have to do to the tiger is like, I have to catch it and skin it,
Yeah.
alive in order to keep it from eating my baby, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of really interesting details like that. And so like the when you hear like, oh, and then burning hot iron shoes were placed on her feet and she danced herself to death, it's a very childish sort of way of describing like how you punish a wrongdoer, right? Like, and
Mhm.
getting the catharsis of the story. But it's
Yeah.
something that like that a kid would find quite, like probably like
And
wouldn't
then,
even think twice about it. They'd just be like, yeah, yeah,
yeah.
of course, obviously.
And then there's the question of how it operates symbolically too, because that's obviously really important, But I totally agree with you. I don't think there's anything wrong with the original, and I don't especially think there's anything wrong with the change they made. It
No.
is interesting, though. I do think what you could say is that the Disney version has a softer, more pleasant, more joyful tone that is clear, but it's just it's different and also good as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, especially because I was pretty annoyed with that wisecrack
Yeah.
video that at the time. Um, and one of the things that most annoyed me is like of all the movies to pick, he picked Pinocchio, and I'm inclined to think that the change in Pinocchio is actually just an improvement because the main difference between the original Pinocchio story and Walt Disney's Pinocchio is that there's the possibility of redemption in the Walt Disney version.
Yeah.
He's just killed horribly in the other one, and I'm like,
Oh,
I
I'm
well,
I'm very excited. I got a PDF of that for the next one we do of these, where we can,
yeah,
we'll watch
yeah. Well, we
Pinocchio
can
and like,
save that
yeah,
for the Pinocchio stream. Yeah, but I think it's interesting. I'm definitely of the opinion that kids can handle um what you might call darker subject matters than we often give them credit for. Though I'm obviously not a huge fan of like people trying to push like stories for adults on children and all that sort of stuff. But I do think, the Disney movie, if I had one criticism along these lines, like it could have been a little, there's a sort of harshness in the original story that is more powerful, I think.
yeah,
Like for example, like in the Disney version, it's a nice little moment, but like when the huntsman is there to kill her, in this version, he just looks at her and is like, I can't do it, man. You run away, little girl. You're in danger. Run away. In the original, she begs for her life.
Yeah.
And so that's a bit, it has a different tone. Like he's totally willing to kill her, and she has to like beg for her life. And there are other moments like that. I'm pretty sure in the Grimm's version, does the witch eat the hunt? Not eat, sorry, kill the huntsman.
No, it didn't have either. Like, neither of them had her killing the huntsman in neither of the versions that I revisited. She
Okay,
eats the heart, and then so another change, from the original to the 1884 that we haven't quite, haven't dived into yet, is the original one. It's Snow White's lungs and liver that she requests, and then it at some point in the 70 years in between that original version and the English translation, it morphed into her heart, which
well, yeah, there's interesting things because like if you go back far enough, people had different ideas about what the different organs did, and like they, I don't remember where I'm getting this from, but I'm pretty sure that people used to think the passions were in the kidneys, and
yeah,
that's a
yeah.
real thing, that that where the passions are, so to speak, have like moved anatomically in people's like symbolic conception of the body. And so that's an interesting choice as well. The lungs thing, like that she tries to go for her lungs in the original version, she's very much concerned with her breath
Yes.
in all the versions of the story that I'm aware of. Like she's like trying to take her breath, right?
Yeah,
And obviously,
lacing her up too tight with the corset is, yeah.
yeah. I'm pretty sure in the Disney version, when she's talking about the sleeping death and everything, she mentions her breath and everything like that. That her breath going still. That that shows up in basically all of the versions, and I think the connection with wanting her lungs specifically is just a slightly more explicit version of that. But that the obvious parallel there is that the breath is almost always associated with spirit and soul and
Hmm.
stuff like that. So there's a sense of trying to steal her soul as well, which there's a lot of those in old stories. But what I was going to say is that in the Jonathan Pajot version, the witch is so mad at the huntsman for not killing her that she has him killed, which is an interesting
Yeah.
detail. But then, speaking of the, like someone said, kids are metal as fuck. Yeah, well, there's definitely a little bit of that in the original. For example, I had forgotten this, that in the Grimm's Brothers version, when she gets the pig's tongue and the pig's heart that she thinks is Snow White's, she eats them.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, I forgot about that. Yeah, so she doesn't just want the heart as proof that she's dead. She wants to eat it.
Yeah.
Wants to literally eat her heart. Like, oh God, is
It's
that
very
how it?
like, yeah, that's how it is, with the liver and the lungs. She wants to eat it. She even like says so in the version, the English translation. She kind of like the huntsman brings her back a box with the pig's heart in it, and then she eats it, and he's kind of like shocked, right? Like it kind of comes out of like it's like, oh God, like wow. But in the
Yeah,
original one, she tells him like, I bring me back her liver and lungs, and I'm gonna eat them, you know,
and
which
that's
is
her actual mother in that
that's her
version.
actual mother in that version. Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
It's not the stepmom, it's her actual mother, which is like again an interesting symbolic change, right? That like in the
Yeah,
original one, the mom, because she's described as like a very beautiful queen, most beautiful, who wishes for a beautiful daughter, and then when
and
that
gets
daughter
it,
it gets
and
it,
yeah,
and then is like, shit, I don't want this. In the English version, the 1884 version, the mother dies while giving birth to Snow White, and then the
yeah,
stepmom comes in to play, and
yeah.
she's the jealous one.
And
With
it's a bit more obvious what goes wrong there. But I do think that original version is interesting, and I think there's definitely something darker there,
Yeah,
obviously, in the mother jealous of her own child, so she wants to like basically consume her,
yeah,
you know?
yeah,
Like that's pretty gnarly, dude. Yeah, and so like that sort of stuff, I'm not of the opinion that kids can't handle that. I do think I think there's a little bit of a difference in like seeing certain things. But in general, I think some of these Disney versions could have been darker. But the other thing to keep in mind is that when he made this movie, there were already different animated versions of Snow White. There's the, what's his name, Max Fletcher, the Betty Boop guy.
Oh yeah.
There's a version of Snow White that he did that's really surreal and strange and like kind of dark and subversive and weird. And that this is kind of a reaction to that a little bit. Like, you know, you can sense that Walt Disney is trying to like kind of maybe a little bit, not in a bad way, but just like overcompensate in the other direction a little bit. You know what I mean? Like this is the most wholesome version of Snow White. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's joyous and playful and beautiful, and it's got a nice little moral message, and it's not too harsh, and it's fun for the kids. There's a lot of fun slapstick, and there's good songs and dancing and all that sort of fun stuff. It still has the core of the story, which is dark. You know, there's a woman who's trying to kill a little girl, right? So they're not whitewashing it, but it is wholesome deliberately, and in a way that like perhaps the original story was like not trying so hard to be wholesome necessarily. But like it's interesting to know that it's sort of a little bit of a reaction to what was going on around him a little bit. And it's kind of interesting now to think that a lot of Disney stuff, especially their remakes of these old stories, like God, there's no way in hell that their live action version of Snow White will be any good at all. There's no
No.
way that they'll be able to do it justice for a whole bunch of different reasons that we don't need to go into right now.
Well, I mean,
But
fundamental misunderstanding of like what the movie is doing is just, like the
yes,
biggest one, right? Like the idea that she is some kind of like the idea that like this is a an endorsement of women being like some kind of meek and, you know, helpless creature, you know, as opposed to
yeah.
just like a fairy tale for a kid.
Well, I
It's
mean, we saw what happened, if anyone actually saw it, but I did. We saw what happened with Wendy in their Peter Pan reboot, right? Like she has to be an action adventurer girl boss now. She can't just be the sort of noble, civilizing influence over, you know, like the whole story of Peter Pan is about Wendy already, and they're like, oh, Wendy is such a passive character. We need to make her more of an active heroic character, and it's just like you just fundamentally misunderstand what the whole point of the story was. And I have no doubt that they're going to fundamentally misunderstand the point of this story too. I mean, they have Greta Gerwig writing it, for fuck's sake. Um,
yeah, that'll work out for him. Absolutely incoherent messages that Barbie did. That's really what
yeah,
Snow White needs.
yeah, and a feminist hack job. That's what Snow White needs. One of the more beloved movies of all time. So I'm not looking forward to that, if I'll even watch it at all, just out of morbid curiosity. But what I brought it up because it's interesting now that Disney is kind of the thing that Walt Disney himself was kind of pushing in the opposite direction from a little bit, in terms of like treating a lot of these old folk tales and old stories in a sort of subversive modern way. And he clearly
Yeah,
wanted to like return to tradition in a sense, right? um with this movie that is very, it's very pretty, and it's nice, and it's wholesome, and it's, you know, like the vision of the golden castle in the sky is a very obvious vision of heaven at the end,
yeah.
and all this sort of stuff that seems just very positive and very I
Well, I
don't know.
mean, what does she do when she arrives at the cottage? Is she imposes order? She forces, like, not forces, but she demands that they wash up before dinner. She
Yeah.
cleans it up for them, and is like, "This is no way to live," you know. Like one of my
Hmm.
favorite lines from this one that I kind of laughed out loud about this because I do this a lot is one of them picks up his mug and he goes, "Hey, my mug's clean," and then he rubs his finger in there and goes, "The sugar's gone." It's like I leave my coffee and tea mugs all over the place until like and all the time I'm just like, oh, you know, a little bit of sugar at the bottom of the mug, boil some more water, put it in the top there, you're good to go, What's the problem with that? Uh, so I love that line, right? But she comes in, she cleans it all up, she gets the, like, she kind of just, like, she exerts a civilizing influence that for the better
Hmm.
upon this bachelor pad that she's crashed,
Yeah.
basically. And she kind of brings them out of this like mire of dirty dishes and muck, and like gets them to start taking care of themselves and everything like that.
Well, she makes Grumpy less grumpy and
Yeah,
less cynical. Like, yeah, she's a very important sort of inspiring, civilizing force in the world. Like she calls for the best out of people. You know what I
yeah,
mean? Just by being good, she inspires people to be the best they can be. That's an element of the story.
yeah.
There's the
Something.
harmony with nature. There's the helping these bachelor dwarfs grow up a bit. There's helping the huntsman not go down the dark path of murdering a child on behalf of the queen. There's, and
I
she
mean,
calls for, yeah.
the animals who are super, skittish at the beginning, right? Like they run away when the dwarves come home because they're all
Mm,
sleeping in the beds, and then they all are like, "Oh shit!" and then they run away and watch, right?
yeah,
They get over that, and then they go and like they break into the mine and get the dwarves back. They pull
yeah.
like there's a scene where the dwarves are like freaking out. They're like, "What are they doing? They're attacking us!" And then they all pull the dwarves back
Hmm.
to the house to try to rescue Snow, right?
Yeah.
So as she inspires courage in these people, she like the dwarves. A very interesting thing at the end too, where like the dwarves were terrified of going upstairs when they thought somebody who had cleaned their house up was sleeping in their bed. They thought it was a monster, and then at the end, when they chase the witch queen
Yeah.
up, like no thought about like their own
They
skittish
risk
nature.
life and limb
But
for
yeah,
her. Yeah.
they straight up are willing to risk themselves to make sure that she's safe, right?
Hmm.
Like there is an inspirational uplifting aspect of this story that is positive. Like it's showing that you can be a positive influence on people, or that a person like her, a young girl for example, can be a positive influence on people just by doing nice things, just by being good. And like
Yeah.
why do we need to take that and turn her and be like, oh well, she's not, it's not 1937 anymore, thank you. I think what
We
we
got to give
really
her a
need
sword.
is
Maybe
give
she's a
her a sword.
huntsman.
She needs to be a huntsman. Yeah, she needs
Yeah.
to be the a badass, right?
Yeah.
Like that's not what this story, like that's not what this story is about. You've
No.
got other stories that you can do that with. That's not this one.
Yeah.
Let's we don't have to reinvent the wheel here.
Yeah.
This is a nice story.
Well, I mean, and it's beloved. People love this movie. People love the songs and everything. It's crazy the influence that this had. I didn't really fully appreciate the scope of it even until I was like watching it. And it's funny because my girlfriend and I were talking about the music in this movie, and she brought up that like what's it called? One Day My Prince Will Come,
Yeah.
the one of the main songs in this movie. Like Miles Davis does a version of that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like the
It's a great
influence is
version. Miles
far
Davis's
reaching.
version is amazing, by the
Oh,
way.
it's really good. It's a really strong melody, and so of course it's a great foundation for a jazz tune. Yeah, no, like this movie is beloved for a reason. It's got a very nice, cozy vibe, among other things. It's inspiring and uplifting and wholesome and noble and beautiful. I mean, it's just stunning to look at. One of the things that I'm not the first person to complain about is that a lot of animation these days just kind of like human characters are ugly and weird and like disproportionate and stuff like that. Sometimes that works and there's a place for it, don't get me wrong, right? But if you look at you know, like
Yeah.
if you look at this, it's all very like the dwarves look kind of silly with their big exaggerated features or whatever, but like she just looks like a normal person. Like there's a desire to make things that actually look beautiful, not just the story, not just the writing, but like it actually looks really,
Oh
really
yeah.
inspiring in its own right, just visually.
Well, and it's interesting because you mentioned the Betty Boop guy's Snow White, and the Betty Boop guy's Snow White it's done in black and white, right? And it's
Hmm.
it's surreal. I looked up a couple of the stills from it. Right, it's surreal, and then Betty Boop. Yeah, like that character was sort of designed to be sexualized. Like
Up.
it's a
Yeah.
very like pinup character. So there's a lot of she's tied to a tree and making the big eyes and her like you can see the is it a garter belt that goes around the thigh, like thigh, the lace around the
Yeah.
thigh and everything. She's always this is beautiful bright colors, right? Everyone, the
Mhm.
queen is wearing a gambit outfit, like she's like the is it a cowl over
Yeah.
top of her hair. It's like it's modest but bright and just like beautiful animation. I wouldn't be surprised too, because this came out 2 years before Wizard of Oz, so I wouldn't be surprised if the people who made Wizard of Oz looked at this for some inspiration on how to create the color and the
Costumes
atmosphere
and the
and the
set. Yeah.
costumes of Oz, and like
Well,
the
yeah, because I mean, the red and the blue is a big part of what's her name, Dorothy's character
yeah,
design as well.
and they
So there's definitely something similar going on there. And like, in the same sort of sense, she's a very nice, noble, wholesome character that inspires the best out of the people around her. There's
yeah
definitely something there because the Wizard of Oz original story is quite different. They made some big changes for the
yeah
movie. Um, and so I definitely think they took a lot of inspiration from this movie.
yeah for sure. I mean the original Wizard of Oz is very much very much like a criticism of economics and everything, right? Like that's the main
I
thing.
What I had heard, I don't know too much about this because I haven't read it, but that one of the things he was like critical of was like mathematical theories at the time. Weird stuff like that. Like it's not necessarily a folk tale in the same sort of way, but The Wizard of Oz the movie does kind of capture that sort of modern folk tale, kind of invents one essentially out of whole cloth, and it's really effective. But yeah, in terms of the character designs and the sets and the colors, very very evocative of this movie.
Yeah,
And I just think it's a shame because one of the things I want to talk about is like the past, the present, and the future of Disney as a company, right? Like this was their first big thing. This kind of set the stage for everything that they did for decades, right? This was their MO, because this was huge. It was a
yeah.
massive success. Everyone loved it. And now look at them. Now
Yeah.
look at
Now
Disney.
look at what's happened.
It's it's un it's unbelievable how far they've fallen.
So
It
this is a an interesting little thing. Just to before we go off on that, because I do want to talk a little bit about that for sure. The actress who played Snow White, who did Snow White's voice in this movie, her name was Adriana Elena Loretta Casaloti, and she also did a uncredited voice for The Wizard of Oz 2 years after this.
How interesting. She's also uncredited as the singer at Martinis and It's a Wonderful Life.
Yeah,
I don't remember that specific scene, but yeah, someone was asking because about her singing. I like her singing a lot. She has a very high-pitched soprano voice, and in terms of musical influences, this is quite a varied palette of musical influences in this movie. I think it's quite effective. A lot of her singing was kind of evocative of like old opera singing.
yeah,
A very wide vibrato, very high. Like when she's whistling with the birds and everything, there's a lot of Mozart's The Magic Flute in there. Like I said, with like some of the tense scenes where they're chasing the witch at the end, those feel very much like late romantic music, from Beethoven on sort of thing. And, a lot of the songs feel like old Hollywood musicals of the 30s and 40s. There's even a little bit when they're singing the silly song with the dwarves. There's a little bit of bluesy, jazzy stuff in there as well. So it really feels like America at the time in terms of music, with the
yeah.
classical European influence, with the blues and jazz influence all coming
A little bit of
together in the sort of
ragtime and the
yeah,
yeah.
all coming together into the sort of the the movie musical palette of the time. It's really good, and I like her singing. It's very, like I said, it's very operatic. It's very classical. It's very kind of old school, beautiful, in is how it's sort of how she's presented. You know what I mean? Because the dwarves, they sing a bit more rough around the edges, but she has this very classically feminine, high-pitched voice, very pretty style of singing, very open, very like round vowels and all that sort of stuff. It's good.
And speaking of the music, one of the like a very interesting thing we're gonna get to after, in a couple of years or in a couple of entries into this this series installment is Fantasia, which Walt Disney, like that was one of his biggest, like most, he really wanted that project to take off. He
Yeah.
really wanted that. And that was his, like, a vision he'd had for a while about blending animation with classical music. So he really
Yeah.
wanted these influences there. For
Well, it's what the most remarkable thing about early Disney is that they're all musicals, all of them,
yeah,
every single one of them. And sometimes people forget, especially you hear sometimes that like, oh, I don't like musicals from people, and it's like, oh, do you like The Lion King? It's like, oh yeah, it's one of my favorite movies, and it's like, well,
yeah,
have you considered that it's a musical? Have you considered
yeah,
that all these classic Disney movies are musicals, or the vast majority of them anyway? Um, they sort of stop around Pixar, and that's, not necessarily a bad thing because a lot of those Pixar movies are really good, but I miss them. I certainly miss these old Disney musical movies. They're great. The music is stellar in a lot of these. Like they're world class. Like, the music that swells when she's awoken from death by the prince at the end of the movie. It's like it's really emotional stuff. It's good the
yeah,
way it's all rising and swelling, and then there's a lot of the technique became known as Mickey Mousing, where the music is exactly following like the footsteps or the actions of characters on the
yeah.
screen.
Womp,
You
womp,
know, for
womp,
example,
womp.
when all the animals are running away because the dwarves are coming home, the violins are scurrying. They're
Yeah,
like all this frantic stuff. A lot of pantomiming exactly what's on screen. Um, Became very popular because of Walt Disney's style and his sensibilities. He was very concerned with making this sort of musical experience with a lot of these movies. And it pays off. These are some of the best.
so these are some of the best musicals of all time. I mean, like,
Yeah. No,
especially these golden age
honestly.
ones,
Yeah.
and like they are really just like a cultural icon of that era, right? Like
Mhm.
these are musical, and I think that's probably what he was setting out to do, right? Is he's like, we're gonna take these and
Yeah.
make musicals, and we're gonna do them, like, it's an ambitious thing to want to do, right? Because, like,
Yeah.
animation has always sort of been tied in with music. Like the Betty Boop moves to the rhythm of the music that she, of the shorts that she's in all the time.
There's the
Like,
Looney Tunes, right? When did they start?
oh yeah, when did Looney Tunes start?
Because one of the things that I learned at one point that I couldn't believe I had misunderstood the whole time is that it's Looney Tunes, Tunes, because of the music. That's how important it is to it. I always thought it was tunes like cartoons. For a long time, I messed that up.
They began in 1930, so 7 years
Okay,
prior to
yeah.
this. Yeah,
Yeah, so from the very get-go, right? Wing Flanagan mentions Singing in the Rain, baby. Hell yeah, it's one of the best
yeah,
musicals of all time.
love it.
I love that movie. If you're the kind of person that thinks they don't like musicals, watch Singing in the Rain. Uh, and if you don't like that, well, then you're not going to like any musicals. Like
Yeah,
it's the best one as far as I'm concerned. There are a lot of good ones, so there's some stiff competition. But man, the singing and the dancing, Singing in the Rain is
yeah.
just superb. Highly recommend it.
As somebody who has said this, made this comment before, if you say you don't like musicals, you probably just don't like the bad ones, and
Yes.
and by the bad ones, I mean in a lot of cases the recent ones. That's probably what it is. It's like you probably don't like a lot of the recent ones. That like when people don't quite, the craft of a
Yeah.
musical isn't quite as important to people as it was in around this
Yeah.
time and before.
I mean,
Like
if you think
early,
about it,
early
like going
Hollywood.
back to opera, it was commonly believed by a lot of people that the opera was the highest form of art because it encompassed so many other forms of art all into itself, right? So there's music, there's dancing, there's lyricism, there's acting, there's set design, all this sort of like all the arts essentially, for the most part, are combined into um, opera. And so like people saw it as like the highest form of art. And in a lot of ways, movies are like that. Movies combine all the arts into one, essentially, except for that they don't have a participatory element to them. Movies are kind of the most complete art form in many respects,
Yes.
but especially movie musicals, right? Because they have everything. They have dancing, they have singing, they have acting, they have lighting, they have camera work, they have, on and on and on and on. So, when he sets out to make his first feature film, it's like he's setting out to make like the greatest thing he can think of, and of course it's a musical, right?
Yeah.
Because, my big soapbox is that culturally we've completely forgotten how to make a good movie musical, and it's really sad because I
I
think
mean, I think you're right about that.
it's just there's all sorts of things you could talk about in terms of filming techniques that, where that aren't nearly as good as they were in terms of like we had perfected the movie musical from like the 30s to 50s, and it was just some of the there's some of the greatest movies of all time. I really think Singing in the Rain is like top 10 movie of all time. It's
Yeah,
so good
I'm with you
and
on
it's
that one.
just stunning, right? And I don't know when the last time we had a good movie musical, honestly. I'm really not sure.
Mean Girls.
You shut the fuck up. Uh, I didn't watch the whole movie. Obviously, I liked Mean Girls, the first one, the one that isn't a musical. It was made into a Broadway musical, and then it was made into an adaptation of that Broadway musical onto film. I saw exactly one scene from it, and it was a side-by-side comparison of the cafeteria scene from the original movie and the cafeteria scene from this new musical. And oh my God, it was worse in every conceivable way. It was terrible. I hated it. I hated it quite a bit. Really bad. No bueno. Anyway, I could rant about all the specific reasons that we don't know how to make a good
When she
movie
sang
musical
"My
anymore,
Name Is Regina George," I clapped.
but God damn. Yeah, Team America. Team America is a
Team
is a
America's a pretty excellent.
well,
Yeah.
that's the other thing is that like yes, they're satirical, but like Team America and I would say especially the South Park movie, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut, they're both really solid musicals, unironically. The South Park movie is an excellent movie musical because, like, first of all, it hits a lot of because you can tell Trey Parker really likes musicals and show tunes and all that sort of stuff. He knows how to imitate them quite well. He knows the little things to do. The South Park movie has like those end of the act musicals where all the musical themes from the different songs that have happened already come together in a big like, ta-da! It's the end of the act. Like
Yeah.
he does all of that stuff, and it's really, really good. And he's really clever about the way all those themes come back together and all that. A lot of really catchy songs in Bigger, Longer, and Uncut. Great movie. Love that movie.
Missed you like Michael Bay missed the mark with Pearl Harbor.
Oh, I really just a quick shout out. The Book of Mormon, if you ever get the chance to
Oh
see
yeah,
it,
that's
even
yeah,
off
it's really
Broadway,
funny.
it's very funny. Quite enjoyed it. I saw it in DC, so it wasn't the original cast, but the cast was quite good. So I
Yeah,
highly recommend it.
I saw that on the West End in London. Pretty good stuff.
My my girlfriend saw it in Orlando, Florida, and there's a lot of mentions of Orlando in the movie. So every time they came up, like the crowd cheered, and they had to like wait for everyone to calm down.
Okay, see, that sounds like fun.
Yeah.
And that's another thing too is like a lot of musicals. If you go and see them on a stage, you're gonna appreciate them a lot more, right? Like,
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
because there's a very cool craft that goes into making those and like getting them off the ground, especially. But like when you start like the movie ones, especially recently, like the Mean Girls one, I joke about that, but the Mean Girls one, or the more famous and more renowned or critically acclaimed would be La La Land, um, which is not a very good musical. Just gonna say, not a great musical. Decent story, Musical, not so much. It's like Singing in the Rain, but worse in every conceivable way. Yeah.
I want to highlight Travion Washington, who says, "I participate in movies by yelling at the characters on screen to watch out for killers or to not go in there." Yeah, see, there you go. We got the participation
Yeah.
going.
Anytime you go see a horror movie, there is some element of audience participation. Like
Mhm.
it's
I mean, one
people.
of the most fun movie going experiences I've had, honestly, was seeing Paranormal Activity with
Yeah,
a with a rowdy crowd. People getting up and walking out. There's one lady who's like, "Mm-mm, nope, nope," and then she like gets up and leaves
yeah.
towards the very end of the movie. That was pretty fun. I think Encanto was the most recent that had any songs that were enjoyable. I actually haven't seen that one, but I know
I
I know a lot of the songs were very popular. With the kiddos, for example.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I
You
mean,
know, I like I let's see. What? I should probably not prejudge some of these more recent ones because I have not seen Coco and I've not seen Encanto, but I did see Frozen and I did not like that. So I'm not convinced that a lot of these are very good, but I shouldn't prejudge them. I should check them out at some point just to see if it's possible that they're still making good movie musical animated movies. But I quite liked the one song that we got in Puss in Boots' Last Wish. That was fun. But I miss the big musical dance numbers and stuff like that you got in a lot of these old movies. Like in The Lion King, like I just can't wait to be king. Like with all the dancing and the
yeah.
choreographed stuff with all the animals. It's great.
Well, I'm really excited to, like especially with this project, I'm really excited to kind of push through to because the golden age ones are these are real. This one for me was really really fun to revisit. I had a
Hmm.
blast with this one. Like it
Yeah.
because it's just bright and pretty and it looks really. I mean, I
Charming
loved
is the word I keep coming
charming.
back
Yeah,
to.
charming and
Yeah.
cozy. Right, like it's just it's got something some special magic. Right, it feels like what Disney used to represent. Like this
Yeah.
is what you used to go to Disney for. And I'm really excited to revisit some of the ones that I have not seen for a while, like Pinocchio
Mhm.
and Dumbo and all that.
Well,
But
I'm very excited for Pinocchio because I think people sleep on that movie. I really like it. It's really good.
yeah,
So I'm really excited to watch that one again. Pinocchio, funnily enough, I didn't realize how much I liked Pinocchio until that
that
fucker,
wisecrack,
the
that fucker
wisecrack
at
fucker,
wisecrack.
started shitting all over it. I'm like, then I started thinking about the movie and going back and watching clips and stuff to refresh my memory. I'm like, no, this movie's really good actually. Anyway,
Yeah.
there's a lot of stuff from this movie that I had forgotten was just deep down in there, like specific shots. Like one thing I was struck by was when they're singing Hi Ho," which is a great song, by the way.
Yeah.
As they're walking back, the shot of like their giant silhouettes on the wall as they're rounding the corner. Like a lot of those shots are just burned into my brain. And like when they're walking across the log and there's the waterfall, that reminded me very much of The Lion King when they're singing
Hmm.
Hakuna Matata. There's the exact same kind of shot where they're walking across the log and then there's a waterfall and all that. I was like, oh, that's interesting. It's a nice little throwback. Yeah, there's a lot of great iconic little moments in this.
Yeah.
A lot of funny jokes, a lot of silly antics.
I love in this one, like that shot that you mentioned about like their silhouettes, and then it pans back or like zooms back to show them like getting ready to go up the stairs. I love it when their silhouettes are talking, right? And then like their
Yeah.
shadows are, they show the shadows during the dialogue, and then they pull it back to show them walking. It's such a clever little thing to do, right? But it really helps make it right. Like you can do
Hmm.
that with this animated style, you know.
Yeah.
I loved the whistle, like the whistle while you work song. I've been whistling to that to myself, like mowing the lawn and cleaning the dishes for like the
Yeah.
past 2 days. It's
Yeah.
just like it's catchy, man. It's
It's
fun.
very catchy. Yeah. A lot of good songs. Jen says Simba sings "I just can't wait to be king," and then his dad dies in the next scene. Suspicious.
Yeah. It,
You can't
regicide
wait,
is
huh?
it's a little
Well,
bit of a it happens.
careful what you wish for. That's the lesson of Disney movies, I guess.
Yeah.
It was also interesting, like with all the wish motifs. I even think they say something about wishing upon a star. Don't they say that in this movie? I remember. I feel like there was a line that was like, "Oh, that's interesting," because that's going to be a
The
big
wish,
part of
yeah, the wish
Pinocchio.
upon a star is in. I know that's Pinocchio's song, right?
There
But
was
like,
there was something that sounded a lot like that in this. I can't remember what it is now,
it's
but
like at the beginning with the wishing well, right? Like,
yeah.
that's probably it.
Oh, just a little detail I wanted to highlight because I like it. It's exactly the sort of fun stuff that you can do in animation where she's singing to the well and we get her echo coming back to her with that like comically like fake reverb on it, you know?
Yeah,
And she's singing in the well and then at one point she harmonizes with herself in the well. That's fun. I like that.
yeah, that is
That's
pretty
the kind
cool.
of fun movie making magic, that it's like, yeah, this is good shit. Because first they're doing the echo and the repeat thing, and then they harmonize with each other. It's got a cool sound to it. And I also there's a lot of funny, perhaps unintentionally funny moments, but like when the prince comes next to her at the well, he's singing as well, and he sings a song, and she goes and he's like hello, like very flatly, very like matter of factly. I don't know. There's a
Don't
lot
run
of
away. Yeah,
there's amusing stuff throughout. And I really like the design of the characters. I really like the sort of primary colors of Snow White, and then there's the opposite sort of for the evil queen who's very, because obviously Snow White is very red and blue and yellow, and the queen is green and purple. Not so much orange, but you get the idea.
yeah.
There's a mirror. And I also like, because they make a great point of Snow White being in tune with the natural world and sort of bringing the best out of the natural world. Because there's a lot of animals in this movie, but the queen is associated with a lot of animals as well. Um, she's always associated with like there's those vultures. Oh, I really like the detail of the
Oh, the
vultures that
vultures
follow
that
her.
follow her. Oh my, yeah, wait a minute, hold
They-
on. Those things are fucking great. So like, okay, Disney has a really good way to like there are a lot of really cute animals in this movie,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
Those vultures are so evil looking. Like I love the
Yeah,
way
man.
that they drew those. Like
Yeah.
they've got like this perfect little sneer, right? And it looks fantastic. And that they follow the queen around and like you don't know what they're planning on doing. Yeah, like you don't know because they're outside the window. They're what tip off the rest of the little forest animals that some shit's amiss here, so they better go get the
Mhm.
dwarves. But
Yeah.
then they follow the queen from the hut and like chase like they watch her fall off the cliff and then float down, which is like such a great way of getting around. So I think the Hayes Code. Somebody mentioned that in the chat. The Hayes Code at this time very strong. Rooted deep in the like what you were allowed to show and not show on
Yeah.
screen.
It's
And
the reason why in every noir movie people get shot and they just clutch their chests and fall down. And
yeah,
like that's it.
yeah, it's really. But this is a great way of symbolically getting around that problem. Right? Is
I almost
like
think it's even stronger. Yeah, because
yeah,
first of all, they seem kind of like they're like her minions, not minions necessarily, but they follow her around like that she represents death in a lot of ways, right?
yeah,
And so they're following her, but then when she dies, they go to eat her too. It's like oh, that's nice.
yeah.
That's really good.
Yeah,
Like,
well, and like
death
it can
comes
even be
even for
like
you kind of
death
thing.
comes even for you, but like they avoid Snow White, right, and they follow her. Like
Yeah.
they don't they're lurking there and watching and seeing what happens, but it's like it's a little bit like the like the oracles, ancient oracles kind of thing,
A
where
little bit,
it's
yeah.
like somebody comes to an oracle and says, "If I invade here, what would it go well for me?" And they go, "Well, if you do that, you'll destroy a great kingdom." And so they go, "Oh, okay, perfect." And then they go and they end up losing, and like it's their kingdom that gets destroyed, right? It's like the
Mhm.
vultures are following her, and you think that it's because like they're there to portend the omen of death for Snow White, but then they end up following the queen even after Snow White is in Snow White's corpse is in the
Mhm.
house, and they follow the queen to the cliff, and they go after her. So it's a really strong symbolic
Yeah.
thing that like and it's a
With all
solid
the things,
mislead.
yeah, and all the things that are encapsulated in Snow White, like survive death. It's kind of the whole idea there that like she, that like she dies, but she doesn't rot or decay. She stays beautiful, and then she can come back essentially because all the things that she are kind of transcend death in a sense, but not so for the queen. You're like when she dies, it's like yeah, the vultures come for you. And I like you said, I do really love the design of the vultures.
Yeah.
But there's also there's a crow with kind of green eyes, that follows her
Yeah.
around. There's a bunch of rats in her dungeon, for example. Oh, what's another great moment is just establishing how wicked she is when she gets the apple and then she's leaving her dungeon and she sees like a cell where someone is being held that's just a
Oh
skeleton
yeah, yeah,
who is
yeah.
reaching for a pitcher for water and she laughs and goes like, "Thirsty? Want a drink?" or something like that,
Yeah,
and kicks it at him. And then a spider comes out, another animal that's often associated with like death and things like that. It's good.
like yeah, and this is one of the, getting back to that wisecrack video. It's like that's not like that's a pretty dark thing to put in your,
That's a
like
dark
it's a
joke. Yeah,
really dark joke.
and it's unnecessary, you could argue. We all know she's evil.
Yeah.
It's not like, and it just kind of further solidifies just how evil she is.
Yeah.
But then like, she laughs at that person and then she dies like not long after. So she kind of gets what's coming to her. But yeah, like you said, it's that's a that's a pretty dark thing to put in a kids movie. So they didn't shy away from all the rough edges.
Yeah. Well, and like they show, like I mean, that's a pretty evil. Like that's something that like the kids necessarily, the kiddos in the audience aren't necessarily going to put two and two together. That like she left the jug of water just out of reach of the guy in the cell so that he would
Yeah.
die of thirst without being able to reach it, right? Like
Mhm.
they're not gonna put two and two together with that. They're just gonna be like, oh my gosh, spooky skeleton, ah.
She sure is a mean lady.
Yeah, she sure is. Yeah, like that's really, really dark, but nice. Like it's a good
It's a
touch.
good touch.
It's a
Yeah.
great touch.
A
I
fun
also
scene.
like I started I Dr. Diddler, $2 in the chat. Thank you very much. Mrs. White, you are browner than I expected.
Yeah, let's
That's
let's talk about that aspect of it, the whole Snow White sort of thing.
yes, yeah.
Obviously, this is a folk tale that comes from Germanic peoples, right? Who are white-skinned peoples. But then the other thing is that like this it's not okay. So when Disney's like, okay, Rachel Ziegler is going to play Snow White, and a lot of people are like, okay, there's a couple things. One, there's why do you feel the need to change races all the time? It's not so much like whether you should ever be allowed to do it, is why are you obsessed with doing it all the time? That's the question I have. And I feel like anyone who is engaged in these sort of conversations about, race swapping and gender swapping and all that sort of stuff, the better question is not whether it's ever okay to do it. It's why do you insist on doing it all the fucking time? It's weird that this is like your kink and that you're so obsessed with doing it, right? Force them to explain why they're insisting on doing it. So there's that. The other thing is obviously it's weird to like this comes from a very specific culture and it would just be a more faithful adaptation if you portrayed someone who was from that culture, unless you're setting it in a completely different time period, but then again you're also changing things that need not be changed. But then the other, probably the most important thing about why she's Snow White is that it's not just because, oh, white people are beautiful. It's like it's purity. It's purity of spirit and soul and all that sort of stuff. Even in cultures that aren't white from around the world, being fair-skinned, it shows up in a lot of old myths and folk tales as something emblematic of purity of spirit and things like that. Light is good and darkness is bad, not just because symbolically, you know, like that's such a deep rooted symbolic idea that trying to portray it as like, oh, well, if it's just about skin color, then we can throw it out the window. And it's like, well, no, it's there for a reason. This is a story that's survived for so long for a reason. It's not a racial thing really at all. It's just that like from the culture this originated in, Like it just represents purity and innocence and all those things, which is very much fundamental to what the story's about. But knowing Disney, that's not what this new story is going to be about anyway. So I guess it doesn't really matter. But you do have to wonder why it's still called Snow White. Anyway, it's just so dumb. It's so dumb. Like why? Why?
Well, and so I assume you were talking about like the whole, the whole idea that like white is purity, right? Like white is purity, white
Yeah.
is light. And, like it's a symbolic color. It's something that I think that we have
That shows
gotten
up in African myths, for the record.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It is not fundamentally founded in racism that black
No,
is evil because skin color. Okay?
no.
That's not where it came from. The African myths, this like it's sun and moon.
Yeah,
Like
it's
light.
as Jay Jameson points out,
Yeah.
dark is scary because we're not nocturnal. It's like, yeah, the light is good and the darkness is scary and oh, but it could also contain something valuable, if you're
Yeah.
willing to all that sort of stuff, right?
Yeah.
And so things that are clean and pure are generally lighter in color, all that sort of stuff. That's what's happening here symbolically. And then, of course, obviously, it comes from a culture where being fair, it comes from a culture in a time period where being fair skinned is part of the beauty standard of the time, right? Because like if you're fair skinned, then that means you're not toiling in the fields essentially.
Yeah. You
As
don't spend as much time out of
it's
doors.
nobility and
Yeah.
all that sort of stuff. And so it's,
It's kind of
it's
like
just
that, like that shows up everywhere too, right? Like this is
yes.
not something that is exclusive to societies where people have pale skin, right?
No.
Like this is something that happened in Japan, which barely even saw outsiders for hundreds of years. China is a very isolated place as well, right? Like these places, women used to paint their faces white because pale skin was a mark of beauty because you weren't out
And
in the rice
nobility.
fields. Yeah,
Yeah.
nobility. You weren't out in the rice fields. You were under palanquins and, shaded by parasols and that kind of thing. Like that's it's the same concept
she-
of like having
and she is a
long
princess.
fingernails proving that like that makes you more of a noble person because you don't have to work with your hands, right? Like that is really like that's it. That's where it comes from.
And the other thing is like she is a princess in the story. She's one who's been like denied her rightful place as a princess by an evil queen and will regain it in the end. That's sort of the arc of the story along that front. You know what I mean? So she is of noble, descent. Same with Cinderella, who like starts off in rags, but it's portrayed as like a wrongful state of things that needs to be, corrected in a
Yeah.
narrative sense. So like the pale skin is also part of the nobility aspect of it too.
Yeah. But it's also
And
like
so-
the other nice thing about it, real quick too, though, like with especially with
Sorry,
the rag.
Dr. Diddler says maybe the sun is also racist. That's true. I didn't consider that.
I had not. Only
Anyway,
and
you were
the
saying.
thing that I was going to say was that the idea of someone of noble birth working in a humble job, right? Dressing in rags, being humble and all that, creating these sort of like virtues that are necessary to have, right? That make you a good person. Like this, right? Like her virtue comes from the fact that she, is willing to perform acts of service for people that she doesn't even know, right? It's kind of the same thing with Cinderella, right? Is that like this idea of coming from low situations or low circumstances makes it so that you appreciate what you have in the nobility more, right? Like you are more appreciative of it. And that is a common theme across all human stories. It's not just from Europe. That's not a Eurocentric value system. That is something that emerges.
It's not a patriarchal
everywhere.
value system either.
It is not patriarchal. No, it is. It is just like humble beginnings kind of thing. Like that. That shows up everywhere in almost every kind of myth. Like every kind of myth or fairy tale, you will find that somewhere in it.
As Jay Jameson says, this whole story is just a nightmare for progressive values, to be honest. And it is.
Yes.
It's one of many old stories that just it poses problems for them. Especially, this is the thing that like the thing that actually makes me upset is not so much that like they can't bring it in themselves to like honor these stories. It's just that but simultaneously they can't stay true to these stories and these values because they disagree with them, but also they're going to use your love for this story to try and convince you to watch their product. And that's the thing that really annoys me. It's like they're going
Yes.
to use all the iconography. They're going to use the designs of these hardworking artists who really believe in this project to try and convince you that this will be like that thing you like, even though there's no way in hell they're going to be faithful to it. They have a proven track record of not being able to, so I don't have high hopes, right? But this story is in many ways problematic for progressive people, you know? And
Yeah.
so they're gonna struggle with it, and it's not gonna be pretty. I'll tell you that. And the other thing that's especially funny about, race swapping the main character is that her her feature of being fair skinned is in the title. It's in the title. And you can't change the title because you need that iconography to get people invested in your version. That's the whole reason they're remaking it, is because it's a thing you know and like. But also they can't allow a lot of the things that they
But
see as old fashioned
they
and
need you.
outdated.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's
I was
just
okay. So I was just gonna say, like, they're remaking it because it is nominally the thing that you know and you like, right? But also, you're wrong for liking it because all the values that it condones
it's
are
not
wrong.
1937
Yeah,
anymore.
it's not
Isn't that
1937 anymore.
exactly what she said?
That is exactly
Yeah,
what she said. It's
yeah.
not the 1930s anymore. She is
Mhm.
not going to be rescued by a prince. Like, she's not even rescued really by a prince in the original, like, in this story. I mean, she is, but it's like it's kind of an afterthought in a way. Like it's just a symbol for, like, redemption at the hands of,
Well, in the Disney version, which because I doubt she's read the originals. In this version, she's saved by true love,
yes.
right? And that's the thing that they can't stand for some reason. It drives me nuts that like so many of these stories that they think are empowering to women specifically are all about characters who don't need love in their lives, and it's like, what? Like how why that's not going to resonate with people because people need love and companionship. That's
Yes.
something almost I'm just fuck it. That's something everyone wants and needs, right?
Yeah.
And so that you're trying to portray it as weakness. It's like by implication it's weakness that she's rescued by true love in this movie. And it's like, well, she's kind of rescued in a sense. I know they're upset about her lack of agency here because that's all they're obsessed with. Um, in a sense, she's saved by the love that she inspired in him
In the first
from the
place, yeah.
beginning. Yeah, exactly. Like that's a big part of it, right? Especially in this version because he's so moved by finding out like it's by the love he felt for her in the very beginning and by her beauty and her kindness and all that sort of stuff. So like
But
I
that's
don't
what
know,
she's
man.
saved by. She's saved by her
Yeah,
own nature. Like,
yeah,
she is so in harmony with the natural world around her that, like, she is able to overcome these situations simply by being good. Like, that's
yeah,
basically what it is.
yeah.
She has
Doctor,
a good head
go
on her
ahead.
shoulders, the right
Yeah,
values that push her through and keep her in harmony with the natural world, that keep her in harmony with the people who she meets, that
yeah,
inspire these people to want to take care of her and to do, like, that's
yeah.
not a bad thing, and we shouldn't pretend like it is, you
Yeah,
know?
and the other thing I find especially annoying is even the idea that this is a story just for women at all. Like that's a good message for anybody,
Yeah.
for everyone. Obviously, there's a feminine tilt to the story. Obviously, there are folk tales and fairy tales that lean more masculine, like Jack the Beanstalk and all that. But they have good messages for everybody. So like the thing that I hate most about the way the like representation matters crowd thinks and talks about stories is that they really act like, oh, well, you're just meant to identify with the person that looks like you or has superficial traits like you in your story.
Yeah,
It's like,
your
no, you're meant to
phenotype.
identify with literally everyone in the story. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like the sort of psychoanalytic idea from like people like Carl Jung is like if you're thinking about your dreams and trying to make sense of your dreams, everyone in the dreams is you.
Yeah.
Everyone in the dream is a version or a part or an aspect of you. And that's the same way stories operate fundamentally. It's like you're the queen to a degree. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? You're Snow White to a degree, and you're meant to aspire to be more like Snow White than the queen. And that is true for men and for women and for everyone in all ages and all that sort of stuff. It's really annoying the way they reduce great stories
You know,
in this
speaking of
way.
Carl Jung, in his Man and His Symbols, that the big famous work that, like, I think that's one of the only things that he ever really published that was non-academic in his life. I remember, I'm
Well,
remembering correctly.
he's published a few things, but anyway, some of them are especially dense. We'll say that.
Yeah, well, that was the one that, like, somebody, like, especially in the intro of the book, it's talking about how it was, like, one of the very first times that he had ever considered writing to sort of
A
sell
mainstream
the, like,
audience,
writing for
yeah.
a mainstream audience, to sell the books, at on at the bookstore.
Mhm.
But he tells a story of a patient of his who had a particularly bad dream about how he was married to a overbearing, hideous, fat, ugly woman, right?
Yeah.
And his real wife was not that, you know?
Hmm.
And so he was like, well, okay, so, like, let's look at it this way, like, that's not true, right? So
Hmm.
what is your dream trying to tell you? Like, what story, why is your brain telling you that particular story when you're dreaming? And it
Yeah.
turned, he's like, it could be something like, oh, he's not sad, he views his wife this way, but, he's saying that he doesn't view his wife this way. Like, so let's
Yeah.
assume that he's correct in that. What is it about this? And it basically, he ends up determining that, like, since, all human beings, psychologically speaking, do have a sort of like, they're, the yin and the yang, the masculine and the feminine, exists in pretty much everybody, right? There's, the
Hmm.
masculine and feminine side. It's like your feminine
I mean,
side is
we don't need to say pretty much. We can just say
yeah.
everybody.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exists in everybody. And he's like, your feminine side is behaving poorly. Like, he ends up, figuring out that it's like that your brain is trying to tell you that the feminine aspects of you are behaving poorly. And
Yeah.
that, this is, like, something that you should be worried about, right?
Hmm.
Like, that's what he ends up determining. And I find that very fascinating that he rejects what is, like, the your impulse to sort of be like, well, you clearly, don't like your wife, right? Like
Yeah,
that.
the very obvious surface level
Yeah,
reading.
and dives a little deeper into it to realize that, like, no, actually, it's trying to give you a little bit of a lesson on how to better adjust the balance in your own self, right?
Yeah, because the hideous wife what obviously looks like you in the dream is married to, that's also you. You
Yes.
know what I mean? Yeah, exactly. A couple things. Let's see. Dr. Diddler says the ideal progressive woman is perfect already and doesn't realize it, which clashes with the reality that nobody is perfect. That trope shows up in so many recent stories about
Oh
supposedly
my
or
god.
allegedly strong characters. I can't stand it. It's one of the worst things ever.
I
It
couldn't.
really is.
It
It's
drove me the
horrendous.
most nuts in fucking Captain Marvel. Like, the whole
Yeah.
thing with
Well,
that.
that's
Like, that's a
quintessential. Yeah.
quintessential, like, example of bad character writing, where it's
Yeah.
just like, oh, she's literally, like, she's Jude Law's character is trying to teach her a good lesson that, like, you can't just rely on your overwhelming arm cannon superpower to get out of every problem.
Yeah.
You have to think, you have to strategize, you have to fight smart.
Hmm.
And the answer to her problem by the end is actually nope, she can just fucking arm cannon her way out of everything, and
Because you
Jude
just
Law is
yeah,
just
you
a
just
stupid man who's trying to control her.
trying to tell her she's not as powerful as she is, and she just needs to learn that she's already amazing. It's an unbelievable narcissistic trope. It's crazy, and it's crazy that anyone thinks that's actually inspiring for people. The other really fun example of this is Rey, obviously, and much has been said about her Mary Sue-ness, but the one I found most striking was actually in The Last Jedi when she descends into the underworld and goes into the cave, and what does she see? She sees herself.
Yeah, not well, yeah, and not like she sees herself. She doesn't see, like, a reflection of herself in her father the way Luke sees
No.
it, right? Like,
No, she doesn't. Well, because okay, so for comparison, obviously Luke goes into the cave and what he sees is a vision of himself if he turns out like his father. And
Yes.
he's trying, and the whole arc of the whole trilogy is like him sort of fighting between trying to avoid and trying to like redeem the aspects of his father, right? Because obviously his father turns to evil, and so but he still needs a lot of those traits like courage and bravery and all that sort of all the things that he had that are, the opposite of are in what's his name, Uncle, um, what's his name? What's his uncle's name?
Owen?
Owen, yes. Owen tries to like, no, he's too much like his father. He needs to stay on the farm. His father ran off and joined this idealistic crusade sort of thing. No, he should stay here. So he has a lot of his father in him, but of course, if he ends up too much like his father, he's going to turn evil. And in the end, he finally confronts his father, and he needs to redeem him as well as the aspects of his father that are good. All that sort of stuff is what's encapsulated in the vision he sees in the cave. And Rey, she goes down to the cave, and instead of seeing anything about her family or any like her darker nature or anything like that at all, she just sees an infinite versions of herself, perfectly fully formed, already good, and then she leaves. What does she learn there? Nothing. She doesn't need to learn anything. That's the whole point of the story. It's awful. Awful, and I hate it.
Yeah, bad writing. You could take a few lessons, Ryan Johnson, from Snow White. Like you
Yeah.
really could. Take a few pointers. The same
Dr.
woman who
Diddler,
wrote.
go
I
ahead.
think it's the same woman who wrote Captain Marvel wrote the Fallout show, which doesn't surprise me at all.
Does not surprise me either. Just because it's poorly written, primarily.
Yeah.
Dr. Diddler says, "I only write stories that have characters that are completely unrelatable in every way." Yes, that is the way. This is the way. Yeah, I don't know. It's I don't think they understand what actually appeals to people. They understand that these stories that they keep going back to change are important to people. That's why they're revamping them all the time and trying to remake
Yeah.
them, but they can't reconcile the fact with, well, the values that I look at and think are outdated are actually quintessential to why people still like it. And so
Yeah.
it's just the hypocrisy really gets me.
Yeah,
It's like,
it drives me a little bit
remember
crazy.
Snow White? Remember all these things about Snow White? Well, we're going to change them. We're going to change all of the core of the story, but leave the skin untouched. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very cynical thing to
You know
do, and
what?
like part of it.
Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt
No,
you,
go for it.
but I thought of something I was going to mention earlier. You were talking about Captain Marvel and Jude Law trying to teach her a good lesson, and her be like, "No, actually, I don't have to learn any lessons." Um, one of the best examples of this is an idea that clearly modern writers are obsessed with, but they don't even learn from the good examples of it. So the sort of female warrior type character, right? The female superhero, right? One of the best examples I can think of is Buffy from Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Yeah,
And unironically, the perfect antidote while still maintaining the same sort of general archetype that they're obsessed with nowadays, but is like actually well written. And what's the main difference between someone like Rey or Captain Marvel and Buffy is that Buffy has flaws and vulnerabilities and fears and problems, and she makes mistakes. And she also gets her ass handed to her a lot. But the story that
well, Buffy. One of the things Buffy has to learn, early on in the show, is that she can't just muscle her way through everything, right? Like if we
yeah,
do a direct one-to-one between her and Captain Marvel, Buffy has to learn from experienced older people that hey, sometimes you got to fight smart. And then other times she gets to show them up, right? Like every
yeah,
now and then Giles will be a little bit too, because Giles is a real person, a real character in
who
this,
also has
who
flaws,
also
and
has
yeah.
flaws. And so every now and then she gets to be like, hey, you're telling me about all this kind of stuff, but why don't you let me try to solve it my own way? And then she goes ahead and she does, and he gets a little bit of like, well, you know what, there's a little bit of a coming together in the middle, right? Like a compromise where it's like, we need to teach you about these kinds of things, but also I do need to, let you be yourself a little bit more,
Mhm.
right? Like that's a wholesome message. It's a good message for pretty much everybody, right? Is like, take the things from tradition that are, that you need to take, and keep them in mind, but be yourself, do your own,
Well, you have to
be willing to, yeah,
be open to things that might be better and all that sort of
yeah,
stuff.
be open, basically be open-minded is the message of that whole thing, which is not the way that Captain Marvel takes that character. And speaking of Buffy, one of my favorite moments, I'm just gonna gush about the show for a little bit, as like one of the better female characters written, superhero wise. That episode towards the end of season 2, Angel's Evil, and there's an episode where Buffy.
Well, really quick,
Yeah.
for anyone that has not seen Buffy and Angel, we highly recommend it.
Yes.
Close your ears for a minute, unless you're, if you're concerned about spoilers, just close your ears for a minute.
Yeah, but so there is a ghost haunting the high school, and it's a ghost of a young boy who.
Oh yeah, yep.
A young boy and a teacher. There's two ghosts. A teacher, an older female teacher, and a young boy are haunting the high school and forcing students to reenact the murder of the woman. The murder-suicide between them. Because they were lovers, and they couldn't be together, and he couldn't handle it. It broke his heart. And so he killed her and then killed himself. And so the ghosts are forcing students at the time to reenact this. And Buffy starts having this problem where she's like really angry at the male ghost for killing this person, right? And she is just like draconian brutal about what she's gonna, like, how she's gonna solve this problem. He's an awful person. He, like all this. And they start digging into the why of this, and it turns out that she's over-identifying a little bit with this guy who, killed his older lover, because she believes that's what she did to her, to her lover, to Angel, to her boyfriend. And there's a really great... The resolution of that episode is incredible, but it's this really great acknowledgement of the way that psychology plays out in people. That like they don't know why they're like, she doesn't know that the reason she's so angry at this kid is because she's over identifying with him. She just is angry, and she has to learn that lesson and learn that the anger is more directed at herself, and she has to learn to let it go. She can't just punch her way out of this problem. And that episode is one of my favorite in the whole.
It's one of the best
ones in the whole show.
Jen correctly points out that it's called "I Only Have Eyes for You" or something along those lines. It's a very good episode, even if you're not familiar with. I mean, I would recommend watching the whole show, but if you were to just pop into that episode, it's pretty good on its own.
It's a pretty great episode on its own.
The other one that I think of along these lines in terms of her flaws is, I believe it's the beginning of season 2 or 3. I don't actually remember, but she runs away.
Oh, I think that's at the end of season 2, and season 3,
something like that. But she runs away, and she has this whole arc where like she runs away from all her friends and all her problems or whatever, and then she comes back kind of expecting everyone to be so happy to see her, but they're all like a little annoyed that she just left and abandoned them. So they've like kind of moved on with their lives a little bit, and then she gets so upset she like almost runs away again. One of the things I like about that so much is that this is a movie about a teenage girl with superpowers, but she's just a teenage girl. You know what I mean? Like, she's a real person who is very emotional, and sometimes her emotions get the better of her. And like the whole learning arc of her,
she has to learn. She has to learn why they're so mad at her, right? Because like she comes back and tries to act like nothing has changed, and and they're like, "No, you abandoned us. You didn't tell us where you were going. Like we've had to be doing this. We're trying, but we're not you." And her mom was worried because she didn't know where she was. She was living in L.A.
She's about to run off again, and her mom yells at her for it. It's a great moment. Joyce is a great character. Dr. Diddler says, "Gonna watch Buffy after I finish Better Call Saul," which I'm slowly getting through. I really think that Buffy has such high highs that some of its lows are worth it, and there are lows.
There are lows. Don't worry, but don't get me wrong about that. There are some times where it's like, but no, it is.
I think the main reason to to bring up Buffy in this conversation is because I think it is probably one of the best examples of this sort of female superhero warrior type characters that so many people writing in Hollywood today are obsessed with, but don't understand how to do well. And I think the biggest thing that it comes down to is like having flaws and having lessons that they need to learn, right? In terms of Snow White, for example, like they're just not willing to tell stories about, like perfect embodiments of traditional ideal feminine values, right? They can't stand it, right? They just
Yeah.
won't do it for some reason. They're obsessed with these female characters that are more traditionally masculine in terms of their role and the archetypal role they play in the story. Which, there's plenty of versions of that done well. Like I'm quite partial to I'm so bad with Lord of the Rings names, but
Oh,
the
Eowyn.
yes. Like that is like that idea done well in my opinion.
Yeah.
Um there are plenty of examples of this, about, and the other thing about storytelling is so many stories are about exceptions and atypical people, right? Because that's what interests people. That like we're interested in on extraordinary things and extraordinary people, right? And that can take many forms. A lot of times it takes the form of like outsiders or people who don't fit neatly into certain categories, right? And so, like, there's nothing wrong with being interested in that. There's nothing wrong with being interested in stories of women who take on more masculine roles inherently. But what sucks is when they twist something that's very much about sort of traditional, classical, straight down the middle, if you will, feminine values and in nobility and all that stuff, and beauty and grace and all that sort of stuff, and try to use that as a venue to tell the same story they can't stop telling about female warriors and stuff like that. It's just really annoying that they can't do both.
Yeah. I mean, like, look at Buffy being obsessed with, like, she wants to look pretty. She wants to do her nails.
Yeah, she
And
just wants to be a normal kid for like half of like the first
Well,
like
she's like a
no
like
all
the whole
the
concept
whole
of
thing.
Buffy,
Yeah,
right, is like that she's a valley girl. Like this is
yeah,
you can see this if you go and watch the original movie, which I wouldn't recommend. But if you go and like read the comic book that was made out of the script, the original script for that first movie, that more closely aligns to where it goes in the show. That's a pretty good place to start with Buffy if you haven't yet, because that it's a little bit of the backstory and everything, and it's the story of the movie but done better, as you would expect, because that movie fucking sucks. But she's a valley girl who
yeah.
is like she's obsessed with shopping and going to the mall, and like she's like
Mhm.
your classic late 80s early 90s teenage girl who
Yeah,
wants to look pretty and cares about going to prom and about boys and who she's dating and who everybody, like,
yeah.
she's Cordelia, who ends
Mhm.
up having to become a warrior,
Yeah,
and she has to try, like, it's like girl Peter Parker, basically, right? Like that's
yeah.
essentially what we're getting, like what he's getting at
And
with
it's
that.
and it's good. Yeah, and a big part of that is the disconnect between the sort of warrior role, protector role type thing, and her interest in just being a normal girl. People have also mentioned Ripley. Yeah, Ripley's a great example. Ripley's one of my favorite characters of all time as well. And that's another great example of the sort of female, like this strong, maybe slightly more traditionally masculine character. But one of the things that's really great about Ripley, especially in Aliens, is that though she's like tough and formidable and resourceful and all that sort of stuff, that she's a survivor, and that she, all the things that she represents in Alien and the first half of Aliens, is that she does have that sort of maternal role with
Yeah.
Newt.
Oh God.
That's
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Especially.
the
Yeah.
best stuff in the movie for me.
That's some of the best parts of Aliens, and like another female superhero that I would say is like a pretty solid one. One of my favorites. The character Elle Woods from Legally Blonde. Fucking great, dude. I love that. I love that character. She's fine.
No, no,
Yeah.
yeah.
Like it's
I
a
like that movie.
I like that
It's
movie a
funny.
lot. It's a funny movie. She's, like kind of an airheaded chick, but she ends up becoming, a pretty good lawyer. And
All
how does
things
she do it?
considered,
How
yeah.
does she end up winning her case? Oh, it's because she's, got that traditional sorority beauty kind of thing. Like, yeah, like
Well,
you
she
can,
has knowledge that they
yeah,
might not that another lawyer might not have.
but
Yeah.
she has to give up some of that. Yeah, like it's a good movie. Legally Blonde, good movie. Like,
Mhm.
you can make it work, and it doesn't have to necessarily be, in a comedy, but that's you've got your formulas, right? You've got
Yeah.
your ways that it can work well, and just taking characters like Snow White and turning them into Rey from Star Wars is not the way to do it.
No.
Like there are plenty of other paths that you could take that might make that story work. But like, why do you need to do it with Snow White? It's just because it's got an iconic.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well,
shit.
there's kind of two ways you could look at it. One is a little more cynical than the other. The more cynical version is that the subversion is the point, right? It's about taking the beloved traditional thing and turning on its head because that's what a lot of progressivism amounts to, right? But I think the more likely explanation, at least consciously, is that like, oh, Snow White, everyone likes Snow White. We need to make a live action Snow White. We should probably get a woman to do it because it's a character about a woman and getting female directors is good. Oh, Greta Gerwig's popular. Let's get her. And then Greta Gerwig is like a feminist, so she's like, oh, Snow White. Yeah, I like Snow White, but maybe we could make it a little more feminist because they just can't help themselves. Like it's
Yeah,
more so, well, they're doing it with Snow White because that's the famous thing they have. And of course, and they're slapping the same story on everything because that's all they know how to do. You know,
yeah.
like that seems probably the most likely and least malicious and more just kind of incompetent thing. Like there's not really the thought that like, oh, well, this seems like the least appropriate story to do this with actually, but fine, whatever, because you tell the same story over and over again, and you're just doing it with this because it's another thing you need to adapt
Well,
because Disney
and the
is intent on
hubris,
doing it.
the hubris to believe that for some reason you are going to improve on a centuries old fairy tale. Like we've been going through from 1812 to 1884 to 1937 to now, right? The story of Snow White has barely changed. It's
In the ways that matter, it hasn't
yeah,
really changed. And then the other thing to mention is God only knows how old the story actually is.
yes,
It was written down for the first time
in
in
18
1880s
like
or whatever, 1812.
18 in the 1800s,
Yeah.
but God only knows how long people in the German countryside were telling this story to their children, right? like
And
like
with different variations depending on the specific misbehaving of their children, they throw in a couple, stuff like
yeah,
that.
but to think that
And
you have the answer, like you alone have the answer, like everybody else who's ever told this story or heard it or enjoyed it is
Mhm.
wrong. You are the one who's going to show them into the light by turning Snow White into a huntsman herself. You know, like
I mean, didn't they already kind of do that in some stupid schlocky movie? Uh, called
Snow
was that
White and the Huntsman with
isn't
Kristen
that what
Stewart. Yeah,
isn't that what happened in that? I didn't watch it. It
it's
just looked
something like
terrible.
that. She becomes a warrior princess,
Yeah.
and yeah, like that
Well, I
kind of.
think that the thing that annoys me most is like, this has survived for so long for a reason. Clearly, you
Yes.
know that to a degree because you've chosen to adapt it again. Because even you are like know that there's something in it that's valuable, but you've just decided that like, well, we should probably update it for modern times. And it's like, okay, it's still important in modern times because it doesn't really need to be changed. You know what I mean? There are
Yeah.
plenty of old stories that we don't think about all the time and we don't keep retelling because they didn't really stand the test of time. There's plenty of them, all sorts of them actually. And so, like, God, how many stories are in the Grimm's Brothers collection? And how many of them have most people never heard of? Like, how many people have heard of the straw, the coal, and the bean?
Yeah. Or
Or let's see. Oh, I just accidentally flipped to Hansel and Gretel, so that's not a good
the
example. Let's
mouse,
see.
the bird, and the sausage.
The two brothers. It's just called Two
It's
Brothers.
just called Two Brothers. I do have one here that says it's called the 12 Brothers. So
Oh, there you go.
That's
Well, I actually there was one called Two Brothers. That wasn't a joke.
it's just called Two Brothers.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
Trayvon Washington says, I mean, they're being so successful with it. Why would they change tech? That's true, kind of. I mean, like, definitely The Lion King 2019 was bad for this arc because it was so successful
Yeah.
and because it fooled so many people. And I mean, but at least what you could say about that one is it didn't really fundamentally change the story. There are some changes that they made, things they cut, things they added that make it worse, for sure. And those are well chronicled by YMS in his video. But for the most part, it's just the same thing but worse. Whereas like Peter Pan and Wendy got like that's an abomination on the original. You know what I mean? That's
Oh,
like
I'm
a
sure we'll.
cancerous tumor growing on a beloved old story. And then the other thing that's interesting about like Snow White is compared to something like The Little Mermaid or Peter Pan or whatever is that like it's a much older story. And so it like
Yeah.
anything that's lasted that long has something to it. And I just wish people would understand that.
Yeah.
Christian O with a super chat. Thank you so much. Says, hi boys, love the Silence of the Lambs episode last week. I'm very glad to hear that. Loving the Sunday film chats. I recommend Sharp Objects on HBO for
Oh
more
yeah.
thriller goodness.
Have you seen
Is
that?
that Amy Adams?
It is Amy Adams, and it's a another Gillian Flynn novel adaptation.
Okay, a while ago, and I'm like years at this point, I saw maybe the first episode, and I was like, oh, that was pretty interesting, and then I forgot to keep watching it. So maybe I will.
I finished it. It's not bad.
Okay,
I enjoyed it. I remember enjoying it
all right,
when I saw it.
I'll have to check that out.
I really like Gillian Flynn, honestly. Like, especially like when we rewatched Gone Girl recently. I was just like, Gillian Flynn. That's a smart author right there. I like what she's doing.
She got some good ideas for sure.
I like the cut of her jib.
Someone asked if anyone here's watched Damsel. No, I did see posters for that, and it just looked like the most cringe thing you could possibly imagine. It's this problem that we're talking about. Like, it's in its most concentrated form. Essentially, it looked really terrible. It looked kind of funny bad. Maybe I will actually watch it at some point. No, but it looked really. Are you familiar with that at all?
I think I've heard about it. Is it Millie Bobby Brown? Is she? Yeah.
Yep. It sure
Oh
is.
boy. Who, buddy? I do not like her. I have a very difficult time watching her and stuff. She really
Yeah.
just like there's something about like it's not anything against her. Like she seems like a pretty lovely person in general, but like
It
yeah,
seems
I just whenever I see her in anything, I'm just like God. She rustles my jimmies.
um, Jay Jameson mentions that Mufasa is looking like a trash fire from the trailer. I absolutely agree. I have no interest in that.
No, I haven't
And
heard.
Dr. Chidber adds that John Oliver, for example, deeply harms the Lion King. Yeah, I've heard that as well. That some of the things he says and does really makes it worse. And someone says correctly that John Oliver deeply harms our civilization. True. It's insane that anyone has any respect for him. His program on HBO last week tonight or whatever it's called is cancer. It's terrible. He's an unfunny liar and a hack, and he should stop it. He should stop it. He should give it up and
He
go
was
home.
on the Daily Show for a while though, and he wins all the Emmys and the
I
Golden Globes.
hate last week tonight. I hate it. It's bad.
Now,
It's
okay,
bad.
so like when you say he's that he's a liar, not to get you off on like a rant about John Oliver, but I need you to put that in a little more perspective for just because I'm curious.
A lot of his programs are just full of lies. I don't know. Like
Really?
I don't
Okay.
have like I mean they're full of like obvious like lies of omission and things like that, and just poor research and citing sources that aren't reliable at all, just to make the point that he wants to make in general. And a lot of them are really dishonest in how they frame things. I mean, that's a classic Daily Show tactic to go like just like you basically take a clip of someone saying something, you cut out any important nuance or context, and then you go, "Wow, he just said that. I can't believe he just said that. Fuck you." I'm just like, "Shut up, Don Oliver." I've seen enough people go through things he's talking about and point out all the things are just not true and obvious like misinformation and
Okay.
deception and stuff like that that I don't have them all memorized. So
I just yeah no
take it,
I
take it
don't
with a grain of salt.
I don't watch any of John Oliver's. I don't watch John Oliver. I was just curious, exactly what we're
Yeah.
getting at there. But all right.
No, I don't like him at all, and people think he's smart and informative. He's not all bad. He has made some good videos on certain topics. The less politically charged they are, the more likely he'll tell the truth about a situation. Um, as you might guess,
Yes.
this goes for many people nowadays. But yeah. Anyway, I'm not a fan, and I especially think he's bad in The Lion King 2019. He's just because
Oh
he's
yeah.
not a good actor. Terrible.
He was kind of funny in some of the appearances he made in Community. I didn't hate him in Community.
That's fair. That's fair. I have seen clip. He's like what is he, a Spanish teacher? What is he in
No,
that? I can't
he's
remember.
he's like he's just like a kind of a pathetic like community college professor who
Okay.
like occasionally lives out of his car. Like he's a satirical take on like academia basically is what he's doing.
Yeah.
And again, that's
I-
not really him. That's more Dan Harmon's writing.
yeah.
Good when it's
Yeah.
good.
Yeah. Anyway, not a fan of his, and I'm not a fan of The Lion King 2019. It's bad. It's a bad movie. But somehow, like, I do think a lot of these other ones where they just can't bring themselves to faithfully adapt the story are worse in a way. They won't be as successful as The Lion King 2019 was. For all its faults, the fact that it just did a lot of things beat for beat, but worse, using the same music, but obviously making all of it worse. Like it still was enough for people because they liked the original. Um, I, when a lot of these new live action remakes come out, I don't usually watch them because I'm just like, I'll just go watch the original. I know it's not going to be good. I am a little morbidly curious about their Snow White just to see how badly they'll fuck it up. I know it'll upset me. I know it won't be good, but I might be tempted to watch it anyway, just to know.
So what are
You
they
know,
doing about the dwarves though? Because like the last thing I remember from the
they're
talks at
CGI,
oh okay,
so
they
they're
just
still dwarves.
they just
So here's like, yeah. So if you don't
Jesus
remember
Christ.
the controversy, yes, you're laughing because you know where this is going. But Peter Dinklage made some comments critiquing them for remaking this and keeping the dwarves because he thought it was problematic to represent people with dwarfism in this way. Um, and so there, people weren't sure exactly what they do about the dwarves in the new movie. Some thought they might make them just normal people. Some, maybe they just ignore his criticisms and go ahead with. So in what they did is they kept them dwarves, but now they're CGI creatures. So really, all that changed is that now dwarf actors don't get any roles.
Yeah.
That's hilarious. Uh, that's crazy. That's so darkly funny that he just ruined
he
that.
eliminated 7 roles for other dwarf actors who could have
Yeah.
taken it, like with a wave
maybe,
of his
maybe
hand.
they're doing motion capture. I don't, still
A little waggle of his tongue, and all of a sudden 7 dwarves are out of work. And he's the only one still making movies.
I mean, maybe they'll like do some weird things to bend over backwards to like portray them more charitably, but they're not to say at all that they're not charitably portrayed in the movie because they're very good.
They're not even
characters.
like they're good characters, but they're not like representative of. They're not representative of people with dwarfism. They're dwarves. They're like mystical fairy tale creatures.
You think Peter Dinklage cares about that distinction at all?
Clearly not. He's got his money. He made his bag. He doesn't give a shit anymore.
Yeah. Fuck them kids, Peter Dinklage. Yeah. He pulled the ladder up.
He's still was that him in Elf? Is he the angry elf? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So he's still mad about that.
He hasn't let
He's
it go.
he's still
I
hung
mean,
up on
he
like the kid. I bet you like in elementary school, like every like it's just like, oh, don't be so grumpy. Uh,
I mean, I'm sure they did, and I'm sure it was actually pretty funny. Um, yeah. Well, so yeah, they have weird CGI creature dwarves now, so that's fun. And I mean, like they've shown still promotional images too, and the lighting looks like trash the way a lot of these
they
modern
all look
movies.
like crap. The lighting in all
Yeah.
of them looks like crap. I like that's one of the things that I'm really because I think the most recent experience I've had with Beauty and the Beast was the live action version with Emma Watson. So I'm like
Mm.
very excited to go back and rewatch the actual Beauty and the Beast, like the
Hmm.
real movie where people cared about what they were making. You know,
Yeah.
like
Yeah. You know what you should do just for fun if you have the time before we watch that one is you should watch La Belle and La Bête, the French,
oh,
like
okay.
the very, very old French movie
Oh,
adaptation of The Beauty and the Beast.
that won't be for a little while, depending. Like,
Yeah,
because I don't
we
know
gotta wait.
how.
What is the order actually?
All right,
'Cause
well, I will go
we've
through it because I have my
You
list.
bring it up because we've mentioned before that we're not going to do this every week with this Disney animate 2D animated feature arc, but we will be peppering them in, if you will, as we
Yes.
cover new things. I'm kind of curious to see if Trap by M. Night Shyamalan is fun. I will let you know if that's worth talking about. But yeah, we do
Okay.
plan to cover new things as they come out, and other older movies like Silence of the Lambs that we like. But
Yeah.
yeah, what are the next ones
All right.
in the order
So
here?
I'll give you the overall. There are one, two, six, maybe seven eras that I would like to cover with this one of Disney. They divided into that kind of thing. So Snow White was the first. Pinocchio
Hmm.
would be next.
Yeah.
And that was February 23rd, 1940 was the original release
I don't know
date.
if we need the date in the year, but I appreciate it.
Yeah, Fantasia, then Dumbo and Bambi, and that is the end of the golden age because at that point, World War II had begun. And so the next two that are the only two that I found because he got diverted during the wartime era to making propaganda, which we might go and watch at some point. The like the Donald Duck Nazi cartoon is pretty memed upon and pretty funny. I've watched it recently, and so we might do a little bit of that. But the two
Why
from
not?
the wartime era that I am most interested in tackling are Saludos Amigos, which is a like live action one, or not a like mix of live action and animation with Donald
Okay.
Duck and a couple of other little bird characters, and Song of the South.
Right, of
Yes,
course. Who could forget
who could forget
timeless classic?
the one that's almost impossible to find? But like I would like to
I
determine for
thought they
myself.
isn't that on Disney Plus with like a thing in front of it saying, "Hey,
No,
we don't." It's
no, it
not.
is not.
Oh,
We are gonna watch that through Internet Archive when we watch that one.
interesting. I was under the impression that that was one of the ones they put just a little warning in front of, but they don't have it.
No, Dumbo they put a warning in front of, and Peter Pan,
What's the one? Oh, the
the
crows?
crows.
Okay.
Dumbo for the crows, Peter Pan for the indigenous peoples.
Oh, fuck off.
Well, what made the red man red? That's gonna be
Song of the South is not on Disney Plus. You are correct.
yeah. They
Mm.
pretend that one doesn't exist, and you know what?
We will not pretend it doesn't
I do
exist.
not want to
We
pretend.
will.
I want to see it for myself. I've never seen it. I've never
I've never
seen it.
seen it.
All
I've
I've
only
ever
seen
heard
clips. I know, like, uh, what's the song they sing? There's a famous
Zippity
song.
Doodah. It won a
That's the
fucking
one.
Oscar. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, my mom used to sing that to me.
Yeah, me too. I used to have a sing along tape like a sing along tape that was specifically just Zippity Doodah, and I loved that fucking tape. I played that thing until it was worn out, man. Like that,
Yeah.
yeah. But I am excited and interested
None
to.
your business says that Song of the South is lovely and shockingly unracist.
I
I can't
believe
wait to
it.
find out. Yeah, it would
I'm
not surprise me. They also have a warning in front of Aladdin of all things too. So
oh because yeah, and you know why? It's because of that little Arabian peddler at the beginning that Robin Williams does the like Oh, and
I don't.
probably
It's
also
not just that. I think it's the whole. I
all of
think they
Robin
have a
Williams.
warning in front of Aladdin, basically for the whole idea that it's not particularly accurate to the culture, which is like, okay, but
Well, it probably also has something to do with Robin Williams doing all his voices because he'll, pepper in like show businessy Jew voice,
yeah.
you know.
No, they don't. They're fine with that. They don't. That's that. It's certainly to do with the Arabic culture stuff. Like they don't give a fuck about his like Jewish people impersonations, which are really funny. He's so funny in that movie,
He
man.
really
It's great.
is. Yeah.
I love all his little. Don't they look lovely, June? Yeah, all that stuff. It's great.
Yeah. My whole like so the way that this all got started is my girlfriend and I were like curious about it, and we've basically built theme days around each movie. So like the day we watch them, we have like particular meals that we're gonna eat. And then
Yay.
yeah, hey man, a Song of the South. I'm gonna have biscuits and gravy for breakfast, and I'm not complaining about, and chicken and waffles for lunch. I'm gonna be eating great.
You're more racist than the movie. SMH my head. Can't believe you.
So after Song of the South, we get to the Silver Age, which is an interesting distinction because this one is Cinderella, then Alice in Wonderland, then Peter
Mhm.
Pan, Lady and the Tramp, Sleeping Beauty, 101 Dalmatians, The Sword and the Stone. I threw Mary Poppins in there because I'm counting that, and I just want to watch Mary Poppins again, and The Jungle Book.
That's a good run,
Yeah, that's
man.
a
That's a
real
great
solid run. Well, and then you get to the Bronze Age, and I'm a little confused as to why this is designated different than the Silver Age, because you have Aristocats and then
Hmm.
Robin Hood,
Hell yeah, dog.
which are both fucking great. So I don't understand why that's like broken up as like, oh, they're Bronze Age. That's a little worse than the rest of them. They're just
I,
as
I
good.
I don't know. Yeah, I'm not quite sure why. I mean, obviously, Golden Age at the height of their, whatever. I get
Yeah.
that, but yeah, it does make it seem like they're lesser, and I'm also not sure what the like what is there a threshold that happens there? The same way with World War II and all that.
Yeah.
Does anything change, or have they just
He might have
arbitrarily
died.
decided?
Walt Disney might
Oh,
have
when did he
died.
die? Hold on, I'm gonna Google it.
Yeah.
Walt Disney died in 1966.
Yeah, okay, so I think that the Jungle Book is the last one before he dies, and then the
Okay.
Aristocats is 1970, so it's the first one
Okay.
after he dies.
Okay, I understand.
So I get that now.
How they
Yeah, yeah.
divvy it up, but
That makes
it is
sense.
weird to imply that they're lesser somehow.
Yeah. So Aristocats, Robin Hood, and then Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh. In
Oh hell yeah, dog!
I am
I
so
like Winnie the
excited for
Pooh.
I'm so excited to revisit Winnie the Pooh.
I haven't thought about Winnie the Pooh in a long time, but I was a big fan when I was a kid.
Yeah, me too. Me too. The Rescuers is the last of the Bronze Age ones. That's sort of
Okay,
a forgotten one, but
that's like the Australian Outback one, right?
that
Or
no,
no, is that
no.
different?
So
That's the one I'm
that's
thinking
so
of.
you're thinking. I'll get to it in a second, actually. So the Rescuers in 1977 was the last of the Bronze Age, and
Oh,
then
that's the mice and the bird. Yeah, okay, I
yeah,
have seen
well, yeah,
those.
yeah. So you might have seen the sequel, which is an interesting one because that is
Oh,
also
the
very
Rescuers Down Under.
oft
Okay.
forgotten. So the Dark Age begins in 1981. The Fox and the Hound, which
Okay.
I remember liking that movie. So like, I don't know if it's because it doesn't perform well or if it's because it's a little darker. Because I know that it's like like there's some pretty dark shit.
I
But
think
like,
that's what they're saying because I know some of these are definitely a bit more weird and mature and all that sort of fun stuff.
yeah,
So
the Black Cauldron, 85.
that's the one people
That's
cite a lot.
The Great Mouse Detective.
Okay.
So the one based on Sherlock
Some
Holmes.
of these I've never seen. I've never seen the Black Cauldron, for example.
I have not seen the Black Cauldron either, so I'm excited for that. The Brave Little Toaster, 1987, will be the next one. Which I forget that's a Disney movie. Every time
I
I
forget
used
that.
to watch
Yep.
that all the time when I was a kid. I did not know it was Disney. I thought it was some other offshoot animation studio.
Yeah.
'Cause they were all kind of popping up around this time. A lot
Yeah,
of the Disney
they sure
animators
were.
left. This is around the same time when Secret of Nim happened, and that was I think specifically an offshoot from the Rescuers. Was one of the guys who had been working on the Rescuers went and did Secret of Nim instead. I'm going to throw Who Framed Roger Rabbit in here because that's a fun
Um,
movie.
It is. Because this is a long list. So here's what I'm thinking. If we want to do all these before we die, maybe we limit ourselves to just the 2D animated ones. How about that?
Okay, fine. I'll watch Roger Rabbit on my own. Okay, so Brave Little Toaster, and then Oliver and Company is 1988. That's the end of the Dark Age, leading into the famed Disney Renaissance, which starts with The Little Mermaid.
Sure does. 89, is that right?
That is in 89.
88? Okay,
Uh,
89.
89. Rescuers Down Under. That's probably the one you're thinking of. That is 1990. And that's interesting because I remember people talking about how like Frozen 2 was the first big theatrical animated release to a Disney one. Like Frozen
Yeah.
was a big one, and then Frozen 2 was the first time it ever got a theatrical sequel. But I don't think that's true because Rescuers Down Under is a sequel to The Rescuers, which came out
Was that theatrical?
yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah. So
Interesting.
like forgotten for some reason, but I haven't seen that one, so I'm excited to jump in.
I
on
feel like
that.
that's one of the ones that they had at the daycare I went to after school growing up. So I feel like, some of these movies are completely forgotten about and then they just don't realize that they're like wedged way deep down in there. I think that's one of them. It sounds very familiar to me.
Yeah, I definitely remember one of the Rescuer movies because I can, or am I thinking of American Tail? I don't know. Uh, a
Who
lot
knows?
of them. So Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Lion King, Pocahontas, Hunchback of Notre Dame, Hercules, Mulan, and Tarzan. That closes out the
That's a great run.
Renaissance. That's a fantastic run.
I was thinking of An American Tale.
Okay, yeah, me
That's what
too.
I was
Yeah,
thinking
all right,
of.
yeah, me too. Then, and
Is
then
that Disney or is that someone else?
that is not Disney.
It says Steven Spielberg presents on the poster.
That would be
Don
Warner
Bluth
Brothers.
film. Okay.
That'd be Don Bluth and Warner Brothers.
Interesting. Continue.
So then after that is the experimental era, which is Fantasia 2000. So the revival of that, which I think probably would double up maybe with Emperor's New Groove, which would be next.
Okay.
Atlantis: The Lost Empire.
I like that movie.
Me
It's been
too.
ages, though.
Yeah. Lilo and Stitch, Treasure Planet, and then Brother Bear is the last one until Princess and the Frog in 2000. So Brother Bear 2003. That was when they were sort of trying to make Phil Collins like the guy for Disney.
Yeah.
And
it worked for Tarzan.
It worked for Tarzan. Did not work great for Brother Bear. I've rewatched Brother Bear recently. There's some funny stuff in it. It is Phil Collins was not the guy. He's not that guy. And then that is the last 2D animated one until Princess and the Frog in 2009 and Winnie the Pooh in 2011, which they call the revival era. But those are the last two 2D animated movies.
I tried to watch that remake of the Winnie the Pooh or revival of the Winnie the Pooh, and all the voices were wrong, and I couldn't watch it.
Oh, no.
I turned it on because I'm like, hell yeah, Winnie the Pooh. I can't remember if this is the old one or the new one. The date wasn't listed, so I just started playing it. And then, like, all the voices just grated on me because they weren't the ones I had in my head. And I was like, oh, sorry. I'm sure there's probably some good stuff in this, with all these different voice actors, but it just felt wrong to me. I couldn't do it.
Yeah, so we may not have to.
I was just like, that's not what Tigger sounds like. I'm sorry.
That ain't Tigger, bro.
That's not my Tigger, bro.
But yeah, so there are a few. That's around the era where they started trying to compete with Pixar in the 3D animated stuff. So parts of the experimental era include movies like Home on the Range, which I have never seen, but it looks like shit. Chicken Little. Where like
I remember Chicken Little vaguely. I think I've seen that one. Yeah.
A movie called Meet the Robinsons. Never heard of it.
Those are robots, right?
I literally can't remember.
Am I thinking?
I do not know.
Meet the Robinsons. No, those aren't robots. Oh God, this looks terrible.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it's well written, but these character designs, in the animation, I do not like it.
Yeah, and then Bolt in 2009.
Okay.
Or 2008, sorry. The dog superhero.
Yeah, I would like to stick to only the 2D animated
Me too.
ones.
Yeah, me too. I'm good with just the.
I mean, Pixar retrospective that can happen later. One of the reasons.
Well, those
I'm
aren't Pixar though. That's the thing. Is like they're not.
I know, but I just mean that like this. We could get to 3D animated Pixar stuff another time. One of the reasons I want to focus on the 2D animated movies is that I really do think it's a lost art form because it's a shame. I know it's expensive. I know it's tedious, but these movies are fantastic. And
Yeah.
they hold up so well in a way that a lot of 3D animation just doesn't hold up in the same way. You know, like I like Shrek a lot, and I still think it holds up pretty well, all things considered. But it has nothing really in terms of like sheer beauty of animation on Snow White from 1937. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of 2D animation, and I would love to see it have a comeback in some way.
Yeah,
Um,
I don't think 3D is better. I think it is its own thing, right? Like Toy
yeah.
Story looks great, right? Like for the time anyway.
I
The
mean,
new ones look great,
Finding
right?
Nemo is my favorite movie of all time. I think it looks incredibly good, but I think it's a shame that we lost 2D in there. It's a
Yeah,
shame.
it
I
is.
just want more of it. It's
So
good.
yeah, and I've never seen Princess and the Frog, so I'd like to see that at some point. The main one that does not that is like a mix that I am going to insist that we watch is Song of the South. Because
Oh,
that
right, that one is the mix. Yeah, well,
yeah.
I'm very curious about that. I want to see what the fuss is about.
Yeah. So yeah, that's the overall list. Is that so? We'll be peppering them in every now and then. We might double up on a couple of them, especially some of the ones like Fantasia, which I think are maybe going to be a little like maybe a little harder to talk about overall. Just
Yeah,
because.
unless we want to really get into the nitty-gritty of, the craft of animation, which is something though I appreciate a lot about. I don't actually know a ton about in terms of the actual craft of animating and techniques and all that sort of stuff. So I wouldn't be especially good at talking about that, except to say that, man, it looks great.
Yeah.
You know, it's just not something I'm quite as knowledgeable about. I could talk about the music, but that's just some of the best classical music of all time. So I could just gush about that for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if we doubled that up with something that has a bit more story to it, that'd probably be good.
When it came out the same year as Pinocchio, so we could do Pinocchio and Fantasia, since we've already talked a little bit about Pinocchio. I'm sure we can talk plenty.
I love Pinocchio. It's so good.
Yeah,
Good story.
2D Clone Wars is better than 3D Clone Wars. You know what? I agree. I agree with that. I like that 2D Clone Wars by I think Gendy Tartakovsky. I don't know how to pronounce his name.
We know who you're talking
But
about. Yeah.
it's the guy, the Dexter's Lab man, and the Powerpuff Girls man, and the Samurai Jack man. He did a lot of great stuff,
Hmm.
especially in that like mid 2000s range for Cartoon Network. So, good for him.
Oh, well, look at that. I got a nice little message on Twitter. It said, "Hi, I think your manners are very graceful. Can we chat?" Isn't that nice?
Interesting.
These sex bots have
Your
interesting strategies sometimes.
your manners are very. That's the Snow White strategy right there.
Oh, how kind. Anyway,
But yeah, so that's the list. It's a pretty extensive one, but I'm excited to pepper in some of these like solid animated movies.
yeah,
Disney's
absolutely.
been around for a long time, and after seeing Snow White, watching Snow White again, there's a good reason for that.
Yeah,
This is a pretty spectacular movie, and there's a reason that people still cling to the iconography of it. You
yeah.
know,
It's very comfy, cozy, nice, wholesome, fun, silly rewatch. It's really
yeah,
nice. It's got really great music. I just think the music is lovely, all throughout. It's just really nice. Good stuff. And it was a joy to rewatch it. I'm very glad we did. Looking forward to continuing the arc, because we're gonna get to some of my favorite movies of all time on this arc. You know, big fan of a lot of these movies.
yeah.
So,
Oh,
uh, is there anything else to say about Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs? Someone pointed out earlier in the chat that dwarves with a V is a Tolkien thing.
Yeah. Oh, is that true? Really? Okay.
That's what they said, that like it's become standard now for people because of Tolkien. I don't know if that's true, but someone said it, and so I'm going to repeat it as fact now.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so somebody pointed out in chat that I didn't know this. So Powerpuff Girls was actually done by Craig McCracken, who I think is also the same guy who did SpongeBob. He is not. It is not Gendy Tartakovsky. I've been operating. Or is Craig?
Under a
Yeah,
misapprehension.
I've been operating under that illusion for decades now. So thank you for pointing that out. Although, did Craig McCracken do SpongeBob? I don't know.
You're just full of lies today, Hugh.
I know.
Just pulling
I'm a
shit out of your
regular
ass.
John Oliver over here. What's going on?
Anyway, thanks for listening to us chat about Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Uh, we will be back next week. I don't know what we'll be talking about next week yet, but we're gonna figure it out, and I'll let you know.
Yeah,
Join us next Sunday. We're probably gonna stick to 12 noon Eastern time.
that is the plan.
That is the plan, unless, of course, we have an Australian that wants to join us, just hypothetically speaking. We might have to move it a little later for their time zone sake. But this is the general time we'll probably do every week, and we're going to try to do it every single week, barring any real life things that come in between it. More Disney animated stuff on the way, more current releases, more, retrospectives on good live action movies to come. Thanks for joining us. Thank you for the super chats. We very much appreciate it. And, have a great week. We'll see you next time.
Yeah. Bye.
Doodles. Sayonara.